We had driven for what felt like forever, deeper and deeper into the Colorado backcountry. The Forest Service road wound through dense stretches of pine and aspen, the trees occasionally breaking to reveal vast stretches of rugged land. No signs of civilization. No fences, no cabins, no distant farmhouses, just open Bureau of Land Management, BLM, land as far as the eye could see. That was exactly what we wanted. Car camping this far out meant absolute solitude. No other campers, no noise except the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of something unseen in the brush. We were miles from the nearest town, at least an hour and a half down a dirt road that didn't see much traffic. The ground was dry, the air crisp with the sharp scent of pine, and the sun was just starting to drop low in the sky when we pulled into a flat clearing surrounded by tall trees. We had 3 cars with us, packed with everything we needed for a long weekend away. 8 of us in total, 3 guys, 5 girls. This wasn't our first time camping together, and we knew the drill. We picked a good spot where we could set up our tents and fire pit, about 30 yards from where we parked the cars in a loose triangle. No cell service, which wasn't a surprise. It didn't bother us. That was the whole point of being out here, to disconnect. We spent the evening the way we always did. Set up camp, gathered firewood, cooked a big meal over the flames. The light slowly drained from the sky, turning the treetops gold before everything faded into deep blue. The fire crackled, and the temperature dropped fast, like it always does in the mountains. A couple of us had brought drinks, but nobody was drunk. Just full, tired, and ready to crash. There was no sign that anything was wrong. It wasn't until we went back to the cars to grab some last-minute stuff before bed that we saw it. The first person to notice was ahead of me, his flashlight beam sweeping over the gravel. He stopped so suddenly I almost walked right into him. What the hell? I heard it before I saw it, the unmistakable hiss of a deflating tire. Then I saw the slashes. Every single car, all 3 of them. The front right tire on each one had a deep, clean gash in the sidewall, like someone had taken a box cutter and dragged it straight through the rubber. For a split second, we all stood there staring. I think our brains were trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe one of the guys had done it as some kind of sick prank. Then reality set in. This wasn't a joke. Someone had done this. And we hadn't heard a damn thing. The fire was still flickering behind us, casting long, dancing shadows across the ground. The trees stood tall and silent, watching. The dirt road stretched away in both directions, empty. If someone had driven up, we would have heard them. If they had walked, we would have seen their flashlights in the dark. That meant they had been here. Hiding. Watching. My stomach felt like ice. Panic hit fast. Nobody said anything at first, just the sound of breathing, of people stepping backward instinctively like it would help. Then we started moving, fast. One guy had a gun, and he pulled it out immediately, scanning the tree line. I didn't even think to be afraid of that at the time. It felt necessary. Someone had been close enough to kneel next to each of our cars and do this, and we hadn't noticed. That meant they could still be here. I kept turning in circles, looking into the woods, trying to catch movement. Nothing. Just deep, endless black between the trees. But I could feel it. That horrible, crawling feeling on the back of my neck. We were being watched. I was sure of it. I don't remember anyone talking much. Just a lot of frantic motion. We checked every car, same exact cut, front right tire, sidewall, no question it was deliberate. We had spares, but only one per car. That meant every single one of us had to be out in the open, changing tires, while somebody, or multiple somebodies, was out there in the trees watching. The guy with the gun kept watch while the rest of us worked. My hands were shaking so bad it was hard to get the lug nuts off. The night was deadly quiet except for the occasional thud of a tire hitting the ground and the wind shifting through the trees. I kept snapping my head up, looking into the woods, convinced I would see a figure standing there. I never did. Every sound made me jump. The scrape of a jack handle, the crunch of gravel under someone's foot, the wind moving a branch, it all felt wrong. I had never been so aware of how alone we were. It didn't take long, but it felt like hours. The whole time, the gun was up, scanning the woods. Then we were in the cars, slamming doors, starting engines. Headlights swept across the trees as we turned around in the clearing, dirt kicking up behind us. Nobody said a word until we hit pavement. I don't remember the exact moment the feeling went away, but I do remember taking a deep breath for what felt like the first time in hours. My hands ached from gripping the steering wheel so hard. We stopped at the first gas station we found. all three cars pulling in together under the harsh fluorescent lights. We called the cops and the Forest Service, gave them our location, told them what happened. But what could they do? Whoever did it was long gone. The cops told us it was a good thing we were armed, that we should always be careful camping that far out. That was it. We never found out who did it. Never found footprints, never saw headlights in the distance, never heard another car on the road. Just slashed tires done in silence by someone or multiple people who never intended to be seen. I still think about it sometimes, about how vulnerable we were, how much worse it could have been. Someone was out there that night, and they were watching us. Something about it felt right. The quiet of the woods, the way the trees swallowed up the sound of the town behind me, the way my footsteps crunched against the dirt and dead leaves. It made me feel separate from everything, like I was stepping into a world that belonged only to me. I had been hiking the same patch of woods for years, ever since I was a teenager. The town I lived in was surrounded by them, thick and sprawling, with a dozen unofficial trails that weaved through the trees. Some led to old, forgotten structures, crumbling stone foundations from houses that had long since disappeared, rusted-out cars overtaken by vines. Others led to nowhere, just miles of trees and dense undergrowth. I liked the challenge of it, the feeling of pushing farther and farther in, seeing how much of the forest I could commit to memory before it all started to look the same. Sometimes I went so deep that I stayed out past midnight. That never bothered me. I had always been comfortable in the dark. Until the night I found the shanty town. I had started my hike late that evening. I had done this enough times to know what to expect. The woods got darker, the air cooled, the animals got quieter. I had a good flashlight, but I kept it off unless I absolutely needed it. I liked letting my eyes adjust to the dark, letting the moon guide me when it was bright enough. There was something about walking through the woods at night that made me feel like I was the only person left in the world. But that night felt different, even before I found it. I couldn't put my finger on why at first. Nothing obvious had changed. The trees were the same, the paths the same, but something was off. There was an absence of sound that I didn't like. Normally, even late at night, the woods had noise, branches shifting, distant rustling, the occasional hoot of an owl. But now there was nothing. Just my own footsteps, too loud in the silence. I kept going, pushing deeper into the trees, further than I usually went. Then I smelled the smoke. It was faint at first, barely noticeable. A distant, bitter scent in the air. I hesitated, then kept walking. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. The woods weren't part of a campground, and I had never seen another person on these trails, not once in all my years hiking here. But the smell of burning wood was unmistakable. I pressed forward, moving slower now, more cautious. The trees thinned slightly, and that's when I saw it. A small clearing. Low structures scattered throughout, thrown together from sheets of scrap metal, pieces of plywood, tarps, and old bed sheets. Half a dozen of them at least, barely big enough to crawl inside. At the center of the clearing was a fire pit, a ring of old bricks surrounding a smoldering fire inside of a burned-out tire. And no people. The whole setup looked like it had been made in a hurry. The structures were crude, barely holding together, with gaps big enough to see inside. Some had old blankets inside, others had nothing but dirt. But there was no sign of anyone. No movement, no voices, no figures sitting near the fire. No rustling from inside the shelters. Just the fire, still burning, unattended. Something about it made my stomach tighten. The woods were dense here, the sky barely visible through the trees, but the fire cast long shadows across the ground, flickering and moving as if someone was standing just out of sight. I stood at the edge of the clearing, listening. Nothing. My first thought was that I had stumbled onto a homeless encampment. But why would they leave the fire going? Why abandon their shelters with everything inside? There were objects scattered around, plastic bottles, a few metal pots, old clothes folded neatly on a tree stump. Nothing valuable, but things people would take with them if they were leaving for good. I waited, heart pounding. Listened for anything, any sound at all. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized how completely abandoned it felt. Not just empty, left behind. The fire popped, sending up a brief shower of embers. I took a cautious step forward. I didn't want to, but something in me needed to understand. Needed to see up close. The first shelter I passed had a blue tarp for a roof. There was an old pillow inside, stained dark with something I didn't want to think about. a plastic bag beside it, half full of empty food wrappers. The second shelter had more in it. A few cheap metal utensils on the ground, a book with half the pages missing, a shoe without laces. Still no people. I circled the fire pit. The burned-out tire smelled awful, the rubber melting into the dirt, black streaks running down the bricks. I kicked at the embers lightly, half expecting someone to suddenly appear from the trees. No one did. The silence felt suffocating. The clearing wasn't big, but it felt like it stretched forever, like I had stepped into a space that shouldn't exist. And then I noticed something. Footprints in the dirt. Dozens of them, crisscrossing the ground between shelters, pressing deep into the soft earth. Some fresh, others older. But none of them led away from the clearing. Just around it, like people had been here. Moving, walking, pacing. And then they had vanished. I stepped back, my skin crawling. Every instinct was screaming at me to leave. I turned, moving fast now, retracing my steps, heading straight back the way I came. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, pressing against my back, making me resist the urge to break into a run. I didn't look behind me. I walked for what felt like forever, only stopping when I was far enough away that the smell of smoke was gone. Only then did I turn my flashlight on, the beam cutting harshly through the trees. I followed the trail, moving faster than I ever had before, ignoring the burning in my legs, the tightness in my chest. I didn't stop until I saw the first signs of town, the distant glow of streetlights just beyond the tree line. When I finally stepped onto pavement, my breath came in ragged gasps. The world felt different. Too bright, too loud, too real after the crushing silence of the woods. I told myself it had just been an abandoned camp, that maybe whoever had been staying there had left in a hurry, leaving the fire burning, that the footprints had just been coincidence, not something meant to trap me in that clearing. But even now, I can't make sense of it. That place wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting. There was nothing unusual about that night. The air was cool, but not cold, and the full moon was so bright it cast shadows through the trees. It was the kind of night that made the world feel smaller, like everything had been compressed into a softer version of itself. The roads were empty, the wind barely stirred the leaves, and the sky was so clear that the stars looked painted on. I was 20, maybe 21, in college in the North Georgia mountains. I had spent years getting familiar with the woods around my campus, exploring trails at night with my friends, letting the quiet settle into me until it felt like home. That night, I was feeling restless. The idea of sitting in my dorm room, doing nothing, felt unbearable. So, I decided to go for a night hike. Alone. It wasn't a big deal. I had done it before plenty of times. The trail I picked was easy, only about a mile long, mostly flat, and looping back to where it started. It wasn't a park or a tourist trail, just a stretch of land in a quiet, rural area where the trees grew thick and tangled. There were no signs, no benches, no trash cans. Just dirt paths and the occasional hunting blind nailed into a tree. I was a little high. Not so much that I was out of it, but just enough that everything felt sharper, more interesting. The moonlight made the entire forest glow with a pale blue haze, and I realized after a few minutes that I didn't even need my flashlight. I left it off. The first part of the hike was incredible, peaceful. I moved quietly, stepping carefully to keep my footsteps soft. It was the kind of silence that felt intentional, like the whole world was pausing just for me. The air smelled like damp leaves and pine, and the only sounds were the rustling of small animals and the distant hoot of an owl. I don't know when that feeling changed. There was no sudden shift, no snap of a branch or gust of wind that made me look over my shoulder. 1 second, I was enjoying myself, lost in the rhythm of walking, and the next, I was uneasy. It was like a slow tightening in my chest, a quiet voice in the back of my head telling me something was wrong. I stopped walking. I listened. Silence. Not just quiet, the total absence of sound. No insects chirping, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. The kind of silence that makes your own breathing sound too loud. Then I heard it. A man's voice. Crying. It came from ahead of me, somewhere off to the right of the trail. Faint, but unmistakable. I went still, every muscle in my body tensing. He was sobbing. Deep, racking sobs, the kind you hear from people who have lost something they can't replace. But under the crying, there was something else, a kind of gibbering, almost like he was trying to speak, but the words wouldn't come out right. It was broken stammering, almost childlike. I should have turned around right then. But I hesitated. The part of me that wanted to help, the part of me that had been raised to be kind, to do the right thing, was fighting with something much older, much more instinctive. My brain was telling me that he might be hurt, that he might need help, but my body was telling me to leave. The feeling in my gut was sick, cold, like the moment you realize you've made a terrible mistake, but it's already too late to fix it. I wanted to call out to him, to ask if he was okay, but my throat wouldn't work. My body refused. I didn't move. The crying went on. Deep, horrible sobs, rising and falling like waves. And then I realized something that made my skin go cold. It wasn't changing. It wasn't getting louder or quieter. It wasn't shifting position. It was the exact same sound, over and over again, like a recording on a loop. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had to leave. I turned slowly, as quietly as I could, and started walking back the way I had come. My steps were deliberate, my breaths shallow. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look into the trees. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me not to make a sound. The crying continued behind me, exactly the same. I walked faster. The urge to run was overwhelming, but I knew better. Running makes noise. Running draws attention. I focused on each step, each breath, every tiny movement of my body. The crying didn't stop. I kept expecting it to change, to get closer, to turn into a scream, to break into laughter, to do something. But it just kept going, the same horrible, stammering sobs, like a man trapped in a single moment of grief. I felt the trees closing in around me, the darkness pressing against my back. Every shadow seemed deeper, every rustling leaf a threat. My hands were shaking. My chest was tight. I kept walking. And then finally, the sound started to fade. Not all at once, but gradually, like I was stepping away from a speaker. The crying grew softer, more distant, until eventually, I couldn't hear it anymore. But I didn't stop. I walked all the way back to my car, not slowing down, not looking back. I half expected to hear footsteps behind me, or to see a figure moving in the trees, but there was nothing. Just silence. I got in my car, locked the doors, and sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. My body was buzzing with adrenaline, my skin cold with sweat. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I started the engine and drove back to campus. The whole time, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing on the side of the road, watching me leave. But I never saw anything. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know if they were dangerous, if they were sick, if they were lost. But I do know that I was in danger. The feeling I had, that deep, gut-wrenching certainty that I had to leave, wasn't paranoia. It wasn't the weed. It was something older, something instinctive. The kind of fear that kept our ancestors alive. And I have never once regretted listening to it. I never went night hiking alone again. I have always been a night person. Even when I was little, I had trouble falling asleep at a normal time. It wasn't that I had nightmares or anything. I just couldn't shut my brain off when the rest of the world went quiet. As I got older, it only got worse. By the time I was 15, it was just a part of my life. I was used to staying up until 3 or 4 in the morning, staring at my ceiling, waiting for sleep that never came. So I started walking. It wasn't a big deal at first. I lived in a small town, one of those places where nothing ever really happens. The crime rate was low, most of the people were old or had families, and there were only a few main streets. The idea of something bad happening just didn't seem real. So when I started going for walks late at night, I never really worried about it. It became a habit. I'd leave my house around 1:30 or 2 a.m., wander around for an hour or so, and then head back. It helped clear my head. The streets were empty, the world felt different. There was something peaceful about it. But one night, that changed. It started like any other. I left my house at 1:30 a.m., wearing my hoodie, hands stuffed in my pockets. The air was cold, but not freezing. The streets were quiet. I passed by the same houses I always did, cut through the same parking lots, walked the same route I had taken 100 times before. It was around 2 a.m. when I decided to head back home. I turned down a side street, moving at my usual pace, when I saw a black van drive past me. At first, I didn't think anything of it. It was just a car. But a few minutes later, I saw it again. This time, it was moving slower. Not stopping, not pulling over, just drifting down the street at a crawl. I still wasn't sure if it was the same van, but something about it put me on edge. It didn't have its headlights on, just the dim glow of its parking lights. I glanced at it as it passed, but the windows were tinted so dark that I couldn't see anything inside. I picked up my pace. I told myself I was being paranoid. But then 10 minutes later, I saw it again. And this time I knew for sure, because it didn't have license plates. Now, I was scared. I wasn't an idiot. I knew that wasn't normal. I had walked these streets enough times to know that this wasn't just some lost driver circling the block. Someone was watching me. I started walking faster, keeping my eyes on the sidewalk ahead of me. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. Running would only make noise. If they hadn't decided to act yet, I wasn't going to give them a reason. But then the van turned the corner in front of me and stopped, right in the middle of the road. It was just sitting there, engine rumbling softly, blocking my path. I stopped walking. For a second, my brain shut down. Every part of me screamed to run, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the van, feeling my pulse hammering in my throat. Then the driver's side door opened. I didn't wait to see who was inside. I turned around and ran. I sprinted down the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my feet slamming against the pavement. I didn't know if they were chasing me. I didn't look back. I just ran. I cut down a side street, turned onto another road, then another. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. But then I heard it. The low, steady hum of an engine behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, and my stomach dropped. The van was still following me. I tore through someone's yard, jumped a low fence, and landed hard in the grass. My legs were burning. My lungs felt like they were about to explode, but I didn't stop. I sprinted through backyards, hopped over another fence, then ducked down behind a shed. I crouched there, trying to quiet my breathing. My chest was heaving, sweat dripping down my face. I peeked out from behind the shed. The van was creeping down the street, moving slow, its tires rolling over the pavement like it had all the time in the world. I ducked back behind the shed, my hands clenched into fists. I stayed there for what felt like forever. Minutes passed. Then more. I didn't hear anything. No doors opening, no footsteps, nothing. Eventually, I peeked out again. The van was gone. I stayed behind that shed for another 20 minutes, just in case. My whole body was shaking, but I forced myself to stay still, listening for any sound, any sign that they were still looking for me. But the streets were empty. I got up slowly, heart still hammering, and took the longest way home I could think of. I stuck to backyards, avoiding the main roads, moving as quietly as I could. By the time I reached my house, my entire body felt numb. I climbed in through my bedroom window, locked it, then collapsed onto the floor, still gasping for breath. I never saw the van again, but I never walked at night alone again either. I don't know who was in that van. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this. If I had kept walking toward that van instead of running, I don't think I would have made it home that night. There's something about the woods that changes when the sun starts to set. During the day, the redwood forests around UC Santa Cruz are beautiful. Towering trees, golden light filtering through the branches, the smell of damp earth and pine needles. The trails are peaceful, winding deep into the forest, away from the noise of the campus. That's why I liked running there. It felt like stepping into another world, one where I could forget about exams, stress, and everything else for a little while. I had a usual route. It was about 6 miles round trip, a long loop through one of the more isolated trails. I liked that it was quiet. Most students stuck to the main paths or the roads around campus, but I preferred the solitude. It gave me space to think, to clear my head. That day, I had left later than usual. The sun was already dipping lower in the sky when I started. I knew I was cutting it close, but I told myself it would be fine. I'd done this run 100 times before. Even if it got dark near the end, I knew the trail well enough to find my way back. About 15 minutes in, the trees started closing in, the canopy growing thicker. The deeper I went, the quieter everything got. No distant sounds of students, no cars, just the crunch of my footsteps on the dirt and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. That's when I saw him. Up ahead, walking along the trail, was a man. His clothes were ragged, baggy pants, an oversized jacket that looked dirty and torn. His posture was strange, slightly hunched, his movements slow. His head was tilted downward, like he was focused on the ground in front of him. I was used to seeing people in the woods. Santa Cruz had its fair share of homeless people, and I had heard stories about some of them living in the forest. But something about this guy felt off. He wasn't heading back toward campus. He was walking deeper into the woods. There weren't any other trails that split off in that direction. The path stretched for miles before reaching a road on the other side of the forest. If he kept going that way, he'd be spending the night out there. I told myself it wasn't my business. I wasn't going to stop running just because of one weird guy. As long as I kept my distance, I'd be fine. As I passed him, he spoke. His voice was rough, cracked, like he hadn't used it in a while. What came first, light or sound? I almost stopped. The question caught me so off guard that for a second, I didn't know if I had heard him correctly. I kept running. I don't know why I answered, but I did. Without looking back, I said, light. For a moment, there was silence. Then, just as I was almost out of earshot, I heard him mutter, "Well, I think it's sound. But who knows?" His voice trailed off into mumbling. I picked up my pace. I told myself he was just some harmless, crazy guy talking nonsense. But there was something about his voice that stuck with me. Like he wasn't just saying random words. Like he was waiting for an answer. The sun was lower now, the light dimming. I reached my usual checkpoint, a clearing with a fallen tree I always used as a turnaround point. I stopped for a second, caught my breath, then turned back. And suddenly, I didn't want to go that way. I was going to have to pass him again. It was fully dark now. The trees blocked what little light was left. The shadows between them stretched longer, the spaces between the trunks growing black and endless. The air felt colder. I kept running. As I neared the spot where I had passed him, I slowed. My ears strained for any sound, any movement. But he was gone. I scanned the trail ahead. There was no sign of him. There weren't any other paths he could have taken. If he had turned back toward campus, I would have seen him. That meant he had gone off the trail. I felt exposed. I didn't like that I couldn't see him, but he could see me. Then, somewhere up on the hillside, I heard movement. A sharp, rustling sound. A branch snapping. I turned toward the noise, heart hammering. The trees were thick, the underbrush dense. I couldn't see anything. Then a voice, a different voice, shouted down to me. "Stop!" It was a girl's voice. I froze. I squinted up the hill, trying to see through the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then movement. A figure climbing down, struggling against the steep incline. She reached the bottom and stood there, breathing hard. Her clothes were dirty, her leggings torn at the knee. Her hair was messy, her face streaked with sweat and dirt. She was shaking. She told me she had been running when a man started following her. He didn't just follow, he chased her. When she tried to lose him, he kept coming. When she left the trail, he left the trail. She ran up the hill, scrambling through the trees, trying to get somewhere he couldn't reach. And she had been waiting there, hiding, because she was too afraid to come back down. She didn't know where he went. I felt sick. We didn't say anything else. We didn't need to. We both knew we needed to get out of there. We ran. Not a jog. Not a steady pace. A full sprint. Every shadow, every rustling leaf, every sound made my skin crawl. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind us, to hear heavy breathing too close, to see movement in the trees. But nothing came. We didn't stop until we hit the road. The streetlights felt unreal after so much darkness. The glow painted the pavement in gold, harsh and artificial. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. She turned to me, whispered a thank you, then hurried off toward campus. I stood there for a long time. I didn't run on that trail again. I don't know who he was. I don't know if he was just some unhinged guy, or if he had been waiting out there for someone like her. Maybe for me. I just know that if she hadn't been up on that hill, if she hadn't warned me to stop, I might have kept running right into whatever was waiting in those trees. The city at night had a certain quietness that I liked. It wasn't the kind of silence you'd find in the countryside, but a different kind, softer, muted, like the whole place was holding its breath. The distant hum of cars on the highway, the occasional horn, the rustling of leaves when the wind blew through the empty streets. It was peaceful in its own way. I liked walking at this time, especially after a long night. The air was cool, the streets were empty, and everything felt still. I had just left a party, one of those gatherings where the music is loud, the drinks are endless, and the people are all half lost in their own worlds. It had been fun, but I wasn't the type to stay out all night. The buzz of conversation and music had started to feel too much, and I'd needed some air. I decided to walk home instead of calling a ride. It wasn't far, maybe 30 minutes on foot. I'd done it plenty of times before. The streets were mostly well lit, and I knew my way around. At first, I wasn't paying attention to much, just enjoying the quiet, letting my mind wander. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, stretching out ahead of me as I walked. A few storefronts had their security lights on, glowing dimly behind metal grates. Every now and then, I'd pass a building where a single apartment window was still lit, someone inside awake at this late hour. It was maybe 10 minutes into my walk when I first noticed him. A man a block behind me. At first, it didn't mean anything. Just someone else walking home, same as me. But something about it felt off. He wasn't just walking. He was keeping pace. Not fast, not slow, just steady, matching my steps. I brushed it off. It was a city. People walked at night. I kept going. 2 blocks later, I glanced back again. He was closer now. That was when I felt it. That gut feeling. The one that tells you something isn't right. I decided to cross the street. No big deal, just changing my route. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps crossing too. I walked a little faster. So did he. That was it. That was all I needed. My body tensed up. My heart picked up speed. I wasn't panicking. Not yet, but I was on high alert. This was real. This was happening. I wasn't imagining it. I didn't want to start running. Not yet. Running could trigger something. Running could make him chase. I scanned ahead, looking for someone, anyone. The street was mostly empty. Storefronts closed, apartments dark. Then I saw them. Maybe 2 or 3 blocks ahead. A figure was pushing a shopping cart. A homeless person. I had no idea if they were a man or a woman, young or old, dangerous or harmless. But right now they were another human being, and that was all I needed. I picked up my pace, moving toward them. The man behind me did the same. I was close now, just a few feet away from the shopping cart. I didn't hesitate. I called out. Loud. Clear. The person stopped, turning toward me. The streetlight caught their face, a black woman, elderly, worn down by the years. I didn't stop moving. I reached her, standing just beside her, breathing hard, my body tense. Then I turned. The man behind me had slowed. He was standing just beyond the edge of the light now, like he wasn't sure what to do. That's when she pulled it out. A knife. Not just any knife, a big knife. She held it up so he could see it, the blade catching the light. That was all it took. The man hesitated. Then he turned. Then he was gone. Just like that. I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, watching him disappear down the street. I exhaled. The woman was looking at me now, eyes sharp, studying me. I hadn't even thought. I had just acted. I'd run up to a stranger in the middle of the night, trusted that they would help me, trusted that they weren't worse than the person following me. And somehow it had worked. We started walking together. For the next few blocks, we didn't say much at first. Just walked. Then slowly we talked. About the city. About the night. About how people saw each other. Assumptions, fears, survival. She told me she'd been on these streets a long time. Seen all kinds of things. I told her I was just walking home. Eventually, we reached a point where our paths split. I stopped. So did she. I turned to her, unsure what to say. Thank you felt too small. But it was all I had. She nodded. Then she turned, pushing her cart, disappearing into the night. I stood there for a moment, watching her go. Then I walked home. I never saw her again, but I never forgot her. And I never forgot what could have happened that night if she hadn't been there. I still walked the city at night sometimes, but I never walked home alone again. The idea had seemed like a good one at the time. A meteor shower was supposed to light up the sky that night, and what better way to watch it than from the top of the small mountain near our town. It wasn't even a real mountain, more like a tall hill with a well-worn trail leading up to the summit. We'd hiked it plenty of times before, usually during the day, but this time we thought it would be cool to do it at night. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend, and 2 others. We were all 16, still at that stage in life where everything felt like an adventure. Night hikes, breaking little rules, pushing boundaries, it made things exciting. One of our friends, the only girl in the group, had been a little hesitant about going, but we convinced her. We weren't doing anything wrong, just hiking to see the meteor shower. We piled into my friend's old car and drove out to the trailhead. The area was just outside of town, a spot that was popular for hiking and biking during the day, but pretty much deserted at night. There was a small parking lot at the base of the trail, empty except for a single car parked off to the side. We got out, grabbed our backpacks, and started walking. The night was cool, but not cold, and the air smelled like dirt and pine needles. The trail was familiar, winding up through the trees in a series of switchbacks before opening up near the top. There was no real danger here, no cliffs, no wildlife to worry about, just a steady incline and a well-worn path. We were about halfway up when we stopped for a break. That's when we noticed him. A man, a little ways down the trail, walking toward us. At first, we didn't think much of it. People hiked at night sometimes. But as he got closer, we could see him better. He was wearing a suit. Not just a jacket over casual clothes. A full suit, dark-colored, buttoned up, stiff-looking. He walked with purpose, steady, not hesitating. We exchanged looks. It was weird. People hiked in all kinds of gear, running clothes, outdoor gear, even casual stuff. But a suit? On a dirt trail in the middle of the night? It made no sense. We didn't say anything. Just picked up our pace and kept going. Every few minutes, one of us would glance back. He was still there. Not running, not slowing down, just walking. By the time we stopped again, he was close. Maybe 10 feet away. Too close. We hesitated, unsure what to do. Maybe he'd just walked past us. Maybe he was just some strange guy who had a reason for being here. He didn't walk past us. He stopped. He stood there for a moment, then asked if we were there for the meteor shower. His voice was calm, normal, like it wasn't strange at all that he was out here in a suit at night, following 4 teenagers up a mountain. Then he asked if he could walk with us. None of us knew what to say. It felt like a no-win situation. If we said no, it might piss him off. If we said yes, we'd have to keep walking with him. So we just kept walking, and he walked with us. That was when things got worse. At first, it was just the uncomfortable feeling of having him there. He wasn't doing anything outright threatening, but the whole situation felt wrong. Then we noticed the way he was walking. Not with us, too close to our friend, the girl in our group. He wasn't right next to her, but he was just close enough to make it weird. Close enough that if she stopped suddenly, he'd bump into her. Close enough that she couldn't move without him being right there. It was like he was trying to get as close as possible without making it obvious. The smell of his cologne was strong. Too strong. Like the kind older men wore. We all felt it. The tension. The wrongness of it. None of us spoke. But we didn't need to. We all knew what was happening. When we got to the top, we sat down. We had planned to spread out, relax, watch the sky. But when we sat down, he sat right next to her. Too close. The rest of us were a few feet away, but he was practically touching her. We saw the look on her face. She was scared. We had to do something. I made up an excuse. Something about needing to leave early. It didn't matter what I said. We just needed to go. We stood up, and so did he. We started walking down. So did he. It was different now. Faster. Tenser. None of us spoke. We just moved. Then we ran. We didn't plan it, didn't even look at each other first. It just happened. 1 second we were walking, the next we were sprinting. All 4 of us. Racing down the trail, pushing branches out of the way, nearly tripping over loose dirt. We could hear each other breathing, footsteps slamming against the ground. But that wasn't what scared me. It was the sound behind us. The sound of him running too. Not just running, sprinting. We reached the bottom. We saw the car. We tore the doors open and threw ourselves inside, slamming the doors, locking them. For a second, everything was chaos. Then, through the windshield, him, coming down the trail, full speed. Something in his hand. A stick. No, a branch. A big one. He wasn't just running. He was coming straight for us. The engine roared. The tires skidded on the gravel as we peeled out of the parking lot. I turned in my seat. He was standing at the edge of the lot now, watching us go. We didn't slow down. We didn't stop. We didn't breathe until we were miles away. At some point, we started laughing. Not because it was funny, because we were alive, because we had gotten away. We told ourselves he was just some guy on drugs, some weirdo, just a freak encounter. Then, 2 days later, the news report. A man had strangled his wife, then killed a girl later that night, on a hiking trail. Our trail. Him. The same man. We never told our parents. We never went back. And we never forgot. There was something off about that place. I didn't feel it at first. When we arrived, it was just another camping trip, like so many I had taken with my dad over the years. We'd been to dozens of remote spots before, the kind where you don't see another person for miles. That was the appeal. We both loved the quiet, the isolation, the feeling of being completely cut off from everything except the woods, the water, and whatever was out there with us. But looking back on it now, something was different about that trip. It was summer, warm but not too hot, and the days were long enough that you could hike well into the evening and still make it back before dark. The campground was primitive, just a few cleared spots for tents and a fire ring. No running water, no facilities. It sat next to a lake, one of those deep, still lakes that looked black no matter how clear the water actually was. We set up camp early in the afternoon, pitched the tent, gathered firewood. The plan was simple: set up, explore, cook dinner, and relax by the fire until we were too tired to stay awake. It was supposed to be easy. The hike was something we hadn't planned. It just kind of happened. There was a rough, unmarked trail that followed the shoreline of the lake. It wasn't an official trail, more of a path worn down by years of people walking through the woods. We decided to follow it, just to see where it went. My dad had heard from someone that there was a waterfall further down, and that was enough reason to go. The forest was thick, old-growth trees stretching high above us, their canopies filtering out most of the sunlight. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, the way deep woods always do. The trail wasn't easy. Roots snaked across the dirt, fallen branches forced us to step over or duck under, and every so often, we had to push through thick brush where the path narrowed. It was quiet. That was something I noticed early on. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, no insects buzzing. Just the sound of our boots crunching against dirt and the occasional rustling of leaves when we brushed against them. About 15 minutes in, we saw the first thing that felt wrong. A slash pile. For anyone who doesn't know, a slash pile is a heap of dead branches and logs, usually left behind by loggers or forest maintenance crews. This one looked old, the wood dry and gray from years of exposure. It wasn't particularly strange on its own, but right on top of it was a shoe. A kid's shoe. Small, faded pink, the kind with Velcro straps. It sat right there on the highest branch, like someone had placed it there deliberately. We stopped, looked at it. My dad picked it up, turned it over in his hands. It was weathered, but not as much as it should have been. It hadn't been out here for years, maybe months at most. There was no other sign of anything. No footprints, no pieces of clothing, just the shoe, sitting on that pile of dead branches. We didn't say anything about it, just kept walking. The trail got rougher as we went. The trees were dense, pressing in close on either side, and the further we got from camp, the more it felt like we weren't supposed to be there. We reached a small clearing and stopped for a break. My dad needed to take a leak, so he turned one way, and I turned the other to give him some privacy. And that's when we both heard it. A child's voice. "I'm over here." Clear as day. Right there in the trees. My dad thought it was me. I thought it was him. We turned to look at each other at the same time. The silence that followed was crushing. Neither of us moved for what felt like a long time. Then, without speaking, we started searching. We called out, walked through the trees, looking for any sign of someone, a lost kid, another hiker, anyone. Nothing. We spent half an hour looking. There was no one. Eventually, we gave up. We weren't comfortable anymore. The excitement of seeing the waterfall had drained out of us. The woods didn't feel right, the silence too deep, the shadows too long. We turned back. That's when we knew we weren't alone. The sound started as soon as we left the clearing. Twigs snapping, bushes rustling, footsteps, real, heavy footsteps. Not an animal, not the wind. Something was following us. We didn't talk about it, didn't acknowledge it. We just walked faster. But the faster we walked, the closer the sounds got. It wasn't just one thing. It was multiple. Footsteps on either side of the trail, in the trees behind us. Never too close. Never visible. Just there. We walked faster. Then we walked even faster. The sounds kept pace. I started to feel it then. The real gut deep fear. The kind you can't reason with. The kind that makes your hands shake even when you tell yourself everything is fine. We weren't running. Not yet. But we were close. Then my dad stopped. Just for a second. And I saw his face. He was scared. I had never seen him scared before. We started running. Branches whipped against my arms, my legs. I wasn't thinking about falling. I wasn't thinking about anything except getting back to camp. The sounds kept up. Footsteps crashing through the undergrowth. Snapping twigs. The sound of something big moving fast. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see. We burst out of the trees, stumbling into camp, into the clearing where our tent was. Silence. The woods behind us were dead silent. Whatever had been following us stopped the second we left the trees. We stood there, breathing hard, listening. Nothing. Not a single sound. We didn't stay the night. We didn't even pack up properly. We threw everything into the truck as fast as we could, tossing gear, collapsing the tent without folding it. 15 minutes later, we were gone. We never talked about it. Never told anyone. And we never went back. I shouldn't have gone alone. That was my first mistake. It wasn't supposed to be a long hike. Just a quick evening walk to clear my head. I had been out in the mountains for a few days, camping by myself, trying to get away from everything for a little while. I had always felt comfortable alone in the woods. I grew up hiking, camping, and hunting. I knew how to read a map, how to navigate, how to handle myself if something went wrong. But I made a mistake that night, and it nearly cost me everything. It started around sunset. I had been sitting at my campsite, finishing a simple dinner, when I decided to take a short hike before it got too dark. There was a ridge nearby, one that looked like it would have a great view of the valley below. I figured I could make it up and back in less than an hour. I didn't take much with me. Just a flashlight, my knife, and my phone. No map, no extra layers, no food or water. That was my second mistake. The trail started off easy. It was well-worn, cutting through thick trees, the ground soft with pine needles. The air was cool, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant call of a bird. I walked quickly, trying to make it to the top before the sun disappeared completely. By the time I reached the ridge, the sky was deep orange, fading into purple. I stood there for a while, taking it in, watching as the last bit of light slipped behind the mountains. And then I turned to go back. I thought I was following the same trail. I was sure of it. But after about 10 minutes, something felt off. The trees looked different. The path seemed narrower, less traveled. I kept walking, telling myself I'd recognize something soon. Then I checked my phone. No service. That was expected. I had barely any signal at camp, and I was even further into the wilderness now. I turned on my flashlight. The trees cast long, twisting shadows across the ground, making everything feel unfamiliar. The deeper I went, the more I realized I wasn't on the trail anymore. I was lost. I stopped, took a deep breath. I had been in situations like this before. The worst thing you can do when you're lost is panic. I told myself I just needed to retrace my steps, find a landmark, look for the ridge. But the more I walked, the worse it got. The trees all looked the same. The ground sloped in ways I didn't recognize. I should have been heading downhill, back toward my campsite, but it felt like I was going deeper into the forest instead. And then I saw something ahead of me, a flash of white. Just for a second, I stopped cold. It was far off between the trees, barely visible in the dim light of my flashlight. A pale shape, a figure. My first thought was that it was another hiker, someone else who had gotten lost. But something about it felt wrong. They weren't moving, just standing there. I called out, but my voice caught in my throat before I could say anything. Some instinct, some deep, primal part of my brain told me not to. I took a step back, and the figure moved. Not toward me, just a small shift, like they were adjusting their stance. Their body was too rigid, too still. I couldn't make out any features, just the vague outline of something human-shaped, wearing white. I turned off my flashlight. I don't know why. It was stupid. But some part of me thought if I couldn't see them, they couldn't see me. I stood there in the darkness, heart pounding, listening. Nothing. No movement. No footsteps. Just the sound of my own breathing, too loud in the silence. Then, after what felt like forever, I turned the flashlight back on. They were closer, maybe 20 feet away now. Still not moving. Still watching. I ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just ran. Branches slapped against my arms, my legs. I stumbled over roots, nearly fell more than once. I kept my flashlight pointed down, watching the ground, too afraid to look back. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs ached, until I couldn't go any further. And then I stopped, listened. Silence. I was alone. but I had no idea where I was. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The forest was darker now, the moon barely visible through the thick canopy of trees. I tried to slow my breathing, to think clearly. If I could just figure out which way was downhill, I could find my way back to camp. I turned, and my flashlight flickered. For half a second, the light dimmed, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw them again. Closer than before. Too close. I didn't think. I just started moving. Not running this time, just walking fast, pushing forward, trying to keep my breathing steady. I kept the flashlight low, watched the ground, didn't look back. I don't know how long I walked. Maybe an hour, maybe more. The fear started to fade into exhaustion. My legs hurt, my throat was dry, my hands were shaking. And then, through the trees, I saw something. A light. Faint. Flickering. My campfire. Relief hit me so hard I almost fell to my knees. I stumbled toward it, breaking through the tree line, finally stepping back into my campsite. The fire had burned low, just embers now, but it was enough. Enough to make me feel safe again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, watching the trees, listening to every sound. By morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. A trick of the light. My own paranoia. Maybe I had seen another hiker. Maybe my mind had played a trick on me in the dark. But when I packed up my gear and started to leave, I saw something just beyond the edge of my camp. A single footprint in the dirt. Not mine. I left and never went back. When I was 14, I went to this outdoor education boarding school tucked away in the Victorian Alps in Australia. The school was situated in one of those rugged, wild parts of the country where the air is thick with the scent of pine, the mountains rise sharp and heavy, and the fog often lingers in the valleys like a bad memory. The kind of place where every weekend we'd set off on hikes through the thick bushland, the kind that pushed you to your physical limits and tested your mental ones. We'd do hikes that lasted anywhere from 2 to 3 days, sometimes even longer, and though the trek was usually exhausting, the sense of accomplishment when we completed each hike kept me coming back. At the time, we all knew the stories the teachers and locals would tell about hermits living out in those mountains. It seemed like the sort of thing adults say to make kids feel nervous or scared. But over time, the idea of some old hermit in the wild became almost a joke between my friends and I. There was no way people actually lived out there alone, in the middle of nowhere. Or so I thought. One of those hikes, though, changed my perspective entirely. It was the end of winter, that time when everything feels like it's on the cusp of something new, but still weighed down by the last breath of the cold season. We were about halfway through a 4-day hike, the second day, to be precise. The fog hung thick around us, clinging to the landscape like a blanket, so dense that you could barely make out the shape of the person walking in front of you. The air was damp and freezing, and despite the layers of clothes we wore, it felt like the cold just wouldn't leave us. The terrain was steep, the ridge sharp, and we were hiking in silence. Not that there was much to say. When you're trudging up a mountainside in those conditions, conversation doesn't come easy. You just keep moving forward, head down, focused on each step. That's when I saw it, out of the corner of my eye, a shape, dark and moving through the fog. It was about 50 meters down the side of the ridge. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog, but as I squinted, I saw it more clearly. A black dog, sleek and well-defined, trotting along the edge of the ridge. It didn't look like a dingo. This was something else, jet black and wearing a collar. I paused, unsure of what I was seeing, but the moment passed quickly, and I kept walking. Then, just as I turned my head back to focus on the trail in front of me, I saw it again. This time, it wasn't just the dog. There was a man behind the dog, walking through the trees. The fog made it hard to tell if he was even real or just an illusion, but his shape was clear. He was dressed in ragged clothes, a silhouette against the mist, looking up at us. I froze for a second, caught between disbelief and confusion. It wasn't the first time I'd heard stories of hermits or loners living up in these mountains, but this felt real. There was something about the way he moved, darting in and out of trees, as though he was trying to remain hidden. It wasn't just a passing figure. I could feel the oddity of the moment deep in my bones. I turned to my mate, pointing down the slope. I told him what I saw. There was a man with a dog down there, just below us. He looked, and immediately saw the same thing I had. His face went pale for a moment, and I could tell that he was just as confused and unsettled as I was. We told the others, but by the time they all stopped and looked down the slope, The man and his dog were gone. The mist had swallowed them up. Some of the guys laughed it off, brushing it off as nothing more than a day hiker and his dog. Probably a hermit, one of them joked. But we didn't talk about it much more after that. There was an unsettling feeling in the air that didn't sit right with me, but I didn't voice it. We kept moving. We reached the Vallejo Gartner hut later that evening. It was a place I'd been to many times before. It had that unmistakable charm, rustic, cold, and covered in graffiti, names scratched into the wooden walls from years of hikers who had passed through. The atmosphere felt familiar and somewhat comforting, like an old, worn-in pair of boots. But tonight, that comfort felt distant. We weren't allowed to stay in the hut because of school rules, so we set up camp around it. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the fog thickened, and the cold really started to bite. There wasn't much to do other than cook dinner, sit around, and talk about the day's hike. I tried to push the image of the man and his dog out of my head, but the sight of him kept creeping back into my mind. It was almost dark when nature called. I decided to head to the toilet, which was perched on the edge of a cliff, overlooking the valley below. As I sat there, I tried to distract myself from the uneasy feeling in my gut by taking in the view. But something wasn't right. There was an eerie quiet that hung in the air. Then I saw it. Words, hastily scrawled on the walls of the toilet. It was a mess of scribbled notes and names, the typical stuff you'd see in places like that. But this one stood out. Written in big, messy letters were the words, "Run, run, run. He's coming. Run." My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't focus on anything else. The cold air felt like it was closing in on me, and for the first time, I realized how alone I was. I bolted out of the bathroom, heart racing, and scrambled back to my tent. I told the guy I was sharing with what I saw. He had seen the same man earlier in the day, and now the two of us were both unsettled, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The night dragged on. We lay in our tents, hardly making a sound, both of us wide awake. The wind howled outside, the cold pressing against the walls of the tent, but it wasn't the weather that kept me up. It was the thought of that man, wandering through the fog, and the creepy words I had seen in the bathroom. We didn't sleep much that night. The next morning was worse. We woke up to find that a large portion of our food was missing. The bags we had kept outside our tents were torn open, and our food, snacks, dried meals, was gone. At first, we thought it was a wombat or some other animal, but the packs had been opened. Zippers had been undone. There was no way an animal could have done that. It hit me then. The man, the hermit I saw the day before. I was sure now. He had followed us to our campsite, maybe watching us from the trees while we slept, and stole our food. It was the only explanation that made sense. He wasn't a hiker or a lost tourist. He was someone who knew these mountains, who lived in the wild, and wasn't interested in being found. We packed up as quickly as we could, trying to stay calm. No one spoke much. The whole mood of the group had shifted. We finished the hike, though it felt like we were being watched the whole time. Every rustle in the trees, every shift in the fog made us jump. We got back to the school, and I didn't tell anyone else what I'd seen. Part of me wondered if they'd believe me, or if they'd think I was just spooked by the stories. But I knew what I saw. The hermit wasn't just a ghost story or some local myth. He was out there, living in the fog, hidden from the world. And that feeling, the one that told me I wasn't alone, stayed with me long after we left the mountains. That hike was the last time I went out there with the school. The mountains held a different kind of weight for me after that. I didn't go back. Not out of fear, but because I had seen the truth, the wild, the unknown, the people who live out there. Those are the things that stay hidden, in the fog, in the corners of the world where no one else looks. It was 4 a.m. on a warm July night in Missouri. The kind of night where the air is thick with humidity, but it doesn't really feel oppressive. More like that heavy, calm quiet that takes over before dawn. I was just getting back to my apartment from a long day of work, and my dog, Lucy, was acting up as usual. She was a rescue, and despite having been with me for 6 months, she was still terrified of just about everything. The sight of someone walking by too quickly would make her tuck her tail and look for a place to hide. Her anxiety had made it hard for us to do much of anything, but I'd grown accustomed to her behavior. Tonight, though, she was worse than usual. She kept whining and pacing at the door, unable to settle. I figured she probably needed to go to the bathroom, so I reluctantly put on my shoes and grabbed her leash. I didn't want to take her out. Not this late, not when the world felt so still and dark. But we didn't have much choice. She needed to go, and I wasn't going to let her just do her business in the apartment. The complex was quiet as usual. Most people were probably still asleep, their windows shut tight. I could hear the faint hum of the AC units in the distance, but nothing else. No traffic, no people. Just the sound of my footsteps on the concrete and the soft scrape of Lucy's claws against the pavement as she pulled ahead of me. We walked down the street, and the further we got from the apartment complex, the eerier it felt. It wasn't just that it was early or that it was dark. It was the kind of night where every creak and groan of the world feels louder. The kind of quiet where your mind starts to play tricks on you. I had almost gotten used to the calm when I saw him. There was a figure standing under the streetlight at the intersection up ahead. At first, I thought it was just another jogger out for an early run, which wasn't unusual for this part of the city. But as I got closer, I noticed that the figure wasn't moving, just standing there, staring. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe he was just standing there for some reason I didn't understand. I wasn't sure, but I didn't want to get close enough to find out. I kept walking, Lucy pulling on the leash as she sniffed the air, a little more restless than usual. Then the figure started to move. It wasn't jogging. It wasn't walking. It was something different. He was skipping in a way that didn't make any sense. His legs seemed to jerk with each movement, his arms flailing slightly as he propelled himself toward me. There was no rhythm to it, no natural flow to his movements, just this sudden, erratic skipping. Almost like he was trying to make himself look harmless, or like he wasn't really moving at all. My heart rate spiked. I stopped walking and stood there for a second, watching as the man closed the distance between us. I was trying to process what was going on. Was he drunk? Hi. Something else entirely? My mind was racing, trying to come up with an explanation for why this man was moving so oddly, why he looked like he had no care in the world while I felt my skin crawl. Lucy's growl broke me out of my thoughts. I hadn't heard her growl before. She wasn't an aggressive dog, not by nature, but the sound was unmistakable, a low, deep growl that rumbled from her chest. I turned around, startled. She was standing behind me, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the figure. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I started to walk quickly, back towards the apartment complex. The streetlight above me flickered as I walked, casting long, erratic shadows on the pavement. I glanced over my shoulder, and the man was still skipping toward me, faster now, the rhythm of his movements somehow unsettling. He wasn't running. He wasn't even walking. He was skipping, with that same strange, jerky motion. I felt my stomach drop. My instincts told me to hurry, to get to safety. Lucy was pulling on her leash, more frantic now, sensing something I couldn't see. I wasn't sure what I was afraid of, but I knew I needed to get away from that man. I picked up my pace, looking behind me again. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted to confirm that I wasn't imagining things. Or maybe I thought I could convince myself it was all just some weird, late-night mistake. But when I looked back, the man wasn't where I had last seen him. He wasn't further down the street. No, he was standing at the entrance to my apartment complex. And he was smiling. The grin on his face wasn't a normal smile. It wasn't the kind of expression someone wears when they're having a good time. No, this smile stretched unnaturally wide, like he was trying too hard. His teeth were visible in the dim light, and it looked like they might have been a little too sharp. His eyes weren't wide with excitement either. They were narrow, almost predatory. But it wasn't just the look on his face that bothered me. It was the fact that he was standing perfectly still, like he had been there the whole time, just watching us. I didn't waste any more time looking at him. I broke into a quick walk, then a jog, heading straight for my building. My heart was hammering in my chest, and Lucy's growling had turned into frantic barking now. She had never done that before. She was so scared. I was scared, too. I glanced over my shoulder again, just to make sure the man wasn't moving. But when I looked, he was gone. He had disappeared into the shadows, like he had never been there at all. I wasn't sure whether that was better or worse. I turned the corner into the complex, and for a moment, everything seemed to be fine. The gates were closed, the area was quiet, and nothing seemed out of place. But the nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't go away. It wasn't just the weirdness of the situation that bothered me. It was the fact that I had no idea who that man was, or what he wanted. And now, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. I reached my building and unlocked the door as fast as I could, pushing Lucy inside before I stepped in myself. I checked the locks, then the deadbolt, just to make sure everything was secure. And then I sat there for a moment, my breathing slowing, my hands still shaking. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just some guy being weird at an odd hour of the night. But I couldn't convince myself. The next day, I spoke to my landlord. I wasn't sure why I did, but I had to say something. I told her what happened, about the man skipping and the grin, about how he seemed to appear and disappear like he was playing some game. She looked at me like she had heard this story before. They've had multiple reports of that same man in the complex, she said. People have seen him skipping around late at night, and whenever the police show up, he's gone. No one knows where he goes. No one knows who he is. But I don't think you're the first one to see him. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't tell Lucy's story about how she had growled. I didn't tell her about the feeling that had never gone away, the feeling that something wasn't right. I just nodded and thanked her for the information. But that wasn't the end of it. I couldn't shake the thought of that man, of his skipping, and of that disturbing grin. It was as if he had been waiting for me, watching me from the shadows. I couldn't explain why, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just a random encounter. There was something wrong about that night, something that didn't add up. And no matter how many times I walked around the apartment complex after that, no matter how many times I told myself I was being paranoid, I never saw him again. But every time the sun went down and the night crept in, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was the summer of 2009, and I was driving from Huntington Beach, California, to Carson City, Nevada. A friend of mine had invited me to spend a few days with him, and I figured the trip would be a good chance to clear my head. It was supposed to be a simple 9 to 10 hour drive, but as I sit here recounting this, I can say with certainty that it was anything but simple. The first few hours of the trip were uneventful. I left just after sunset, wanting to avoid the worst of the Los Angeles traffic. By the time I hit the open highways near Victorville, the city lights were behind me, and the only company I had was the hum of my car engine and the occasional trucker on the road. I always found these drives oddly peaceful, though there was something about the barren stretches of highway that felt unsettling if you thought about them too much. Around midnight, I passed through the small town of Lone Pine, heading toward the eastern Sierra Nevadas. The towering mountains on one side and the vast desert on the other created a sense of isolation that was both awe-inspiring and unnerving. I had music playing low on the radio and a thermos of coffee beside me to keep me awake. Somewhere near Bridgeport, a remote mountain town about 3 hours from my destination, things started to get strange. It was well past 2 a.m., and the road had become winding and narrow, with steep drops on one side. The darkness was oppressive, with only my headlights cutting through it. That's when I noticed a bright light behind me. At first, I thought it was just another car, maybe a truck or an off-road vehicle. But the light was unusually bright, almost blinding. It didn't make sense for someone to be using high beams on such a curvy road, especially when there was no way to pass me. I glanced at my rearview mirror and squinted, trying to make out the vehicle. It wasn't a car, though. It didn't have the distinct 2 points of light you'd expect from headlights. It was just a single, intense glow. The light drew closer, so bright that it illuminated the inside of my car. My dashboard and hands on the steering wheel were glowing, as if someone had pointed a massive spotlight directly at me. I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. I told myself it was just a prankster, or maybe even a highway patrol car with an overpowered spotlight, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I tried focusing on the road ahead, but the light kept getting brighter and closer. It was so intense that I couldn't look in my rearview or side mirrors anymore without being blinded. My palms started to sweat, and I gripped the wheel tighter, unsure of what to do. Should I pull over? Speed up? My heart was racing, and my instincts were screaming at me to get away. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the light vanished. I slammed on my brakes, pulling off to the side of the road. My chest heaved as I tried to steady my breathing. The darkness was back, thick and heavy, and there was no sign of the light or any vehicle behind me. I sat there for a moment, my hands shaking on the wheel, before convincing myself to keep driving. I had no explanation for what had just happened, but I didn't want to sit there alone in the middle of nowhere. The next thing I remember, it was daylight. I was sitting in my car, which was idling in a parking lot I didn't recognize. I looked around, disoriented. It was a municipal lot with a few trucks parked nearby and a vending machine off to one side. My car was the only civilian vehicle there. The dashboard clock said it was 9:45 a.m., but the last time I had checked, it was just after 2 a.m. Where had the last 7 hours gone? I felt a strange heaviness in my body, like I'd just woken up from a deep sleep, but I couldn't remember pulling over to rest. My coffee thermos was empty, though I didn't remember drinking it all. The gas gauge was lower than it should have been, as if I'd been driving for hours, but I had no memory of the roads or scenery. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, startling me. It was my friend, asking where I was. I told him I was on my way and should be there in a few hours. There was a long pause before he responded. "What are you talking about?" he said. "It's been 3 days since I last heard from you." I stared at the screen, feeling a chill creep down my spine. "That's not possible," I replied. "I've been driving the whole time. Maybe I stopped to nap, but it hasn't been 3 days." "You've been partying, haven't you?" he said, his tone accusatory. "If you're messing around in some hotel, just tell me." "I'm not," I insisted. "I'm coming right now." The rest of the drive to Carson City was surreal. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. When I arrived, my friend looked genuinely shocked to see me. He kept asking what I'd been doing for the past 3 days, but I had no answers. I checked my phone's call log and GPS history, but there were no records of activity during that time. It was as if I'd simply ceased to exist for 3 days. Over the years, I've tried to make sense of what happened. A friend of mine, who's a member of Mensa and a former Air Force officer, once listened to my story and told me it sounded like a classic abduction scenario. He mentioned the bright light, the missing time, and the sudden reappearance in an unfamiliar place as common elements in such cases. I laughed it off at the time, but deep down, I couldn't ignore the possibility. I've never told anyone else about that night. It still haunts me, not just because of what might have happened, but because I'll probably never know the truth. Every now and then, I'll catch myself staring at the sky, wondering if whatever I saw out there is still watching. One thing I'm certain of, we are not alone. It was late October of 2017. I remember the year clearly because that fall had been unusually warm, with a few days still reaching the mid-70s. By the time night fell, though, the temperatures would drop quickly, leaving the air damp and cold. I was driving down a narrow, rural road just outside of Waverly, Tennessee. It was one of those roads primarily used by farmers, paved but barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass. Deep ditches lined either side, and beyond them were thick woods that often flooded into swampy pockets after heavy rains. It was the kind of road you didn't want to find yourself on unless you knew it well, and I did. Or at least, I thought I did. That night, I was coming back from a late shift at the manufacturing plant where I worked. My coworker had called out sick, so I stayed longer than usual, pushing my drive home to just after 1 a.m. I didn't mind the late hour. I'd done the drive dozens of times before and was used to the eerie quiet of these back roads. There was rarely any traffic that late, and I could usually zone out with the low hum of my car's engine as my only companion. The night was unusually still, with the kind of silence that feels heavy. My high beams were on, cutting through the darkness and reflecting off the occasional patches of fog that hugged the road. The fall weather meant deer were more active, and I was scanning the ditches for any sudden movement. Hitting a deer out here wasn't just dangerous, it was a guaranteed way to wreck your car and leave you stranded miles from the nearest help. The first mile of the road was uneventful, just the crunch of gravel under my tires and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. But as I passed through a particularly low stretch of road where the woods pressed closer, I drove into a pocket of dense ground fog. It wasn't unusual for fog to pool in that area. It was near a shallow creek, but it was thick enough that I instinctively slowed down, keeping my hands tight on the wheel. The fog clung to my car for a few seconds, blurring the edges of my headlights, and then, just as suddenly as I had entered it, I was out. Visibility was crystal clear again, and my eyes immediately scanned the ditches out of habit. That's when I saw it. A figure was crawling out of the ditch on my right side. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe someone who had gotten lost or drunk and ended up in the ditch. But something about the way it moved made my stomach twist. It didn't crawl like a person would. It jerked forward in short, uneven bursts, like it was being yanked by invisible strings. Its movements were unnatural, almost mechanical, and yet there was no sound. No rustling leaves, no crunch of dirt or gravel. I slowed the car down instinctively, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. The figure had no legs. From the waist down, there was nothing but empty space, and yet it was pulling itself forward with its arms, which looked unnaturally long and thin. It was pale, almost grayish, and as my headlights passed over it, I saw its head turn toward me. There were no facial features that I could make out, just a smooth, blank surface where a face should have been. I gasped and instinctively swerved slightly to the left, away from the ditch. My tires skidded on the loose gravel, and for a second, I thought I was going to slide into the opposite ditch. But I managed to straighten out, and when I looked back at the road, the figure was gone. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and my palms were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. I didn't stop to look back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get as far away from that spot as possible. About half a mile up the road, I found a field entrance wide enough to turn my car around. I hesitated for a moment, staring into the darkness behind me. Something about what I had seen felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I told myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it had been a deer caught in an awkward position, or maybe some branches had fallen into the ditch and created the illusion of movement. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, but I couldn't explain what I had seen. It wasn't natural. It wasn't normal. I turned the car around and gunned it all the way home. My heart didn't stop racing until I was safely in my driveway, and even then, I couldn't shake the image of that figure jerking its way out of the ditch. I didn't sleep much that night. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I told a few people at work, hoping they might have an explanation that made sense. Most of them laughed it off, saying I must have been overtired or imagining things. A couple joked about swamp gas or a trick of the headlights. I laughed along with them, but I knew what I had seen. I started avoiding that road entirely, even if it added an extra 10 minutes to my drive. I didn't want to be anywhere near that stretch of woods. A few weeks later, my boss asked me to help him with some field work. We needed to move equipment to one of his properties, and the quickest route took us down that same road. I hesitated but didn't want to seem paranoid, so I went along. As we drove past the spot where I'd seen the figure, my chest tightened, and I couldn't resist telling him about it. To my surprise, he didn't laugh or brush it off. Instead, he gave me a strange look and said, "You know, a farmer died out here years ago. Rolled his tractor into one of these ditches. They said he was crushed beneath it, and by the time anyone found him, there wasn't much left." I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't known about the accident, and I didn't know the man or his family. But hearing that story made me wonder if there was some connection between his death and what I had seen. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the thought lingered in the back of my mind. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe my tired brain conjured up something that wasn't really there. But when I think back to the way that figure moved, the unnatural jerking motion and the smooth blankness where its face should have been, I can't shake the feeling that it was something real. Something I wasn't supposed to see. I haven't driven down that road since, and I don't plan to. Some things are better left unexplored. I was driving across the country from Washington State to Georgia in the summer of 2023. It was June 29th when we first hit the road, and I knew it was going to be a long journey. The plan was to make the drive in stages. Just me and my friend, with our trusty dog, Ellie, curled up in the back seat. The miles felt like they stretched on forever, especially with the seemingly endless stretches of highway passing beneath the wheels. The journey had been pretty uneventful until we passed through Laramie, Wyoming. By then, we'd already been driving for hours, the road just one long, monotonous stretch, and I felt my eyelids growing heavy. I'd been keeping the wheel steady, but after switching freeways and heading into a more isolated stretch of road, the fatigue hit hard. I told my friend to take over, and I nodded off. I can't remember exactly when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, we were passing through Colorado Springs, Colorado. The sun was lower in the sky now, and it was my turn to take over. My friend looked exhausted, like he'd been driving for far too long. As we swapped seats, he muttered something about needing sleep. "You okay?" I asked, just glancing at him as I settled in. His eyes were heavy, but I figured it was just from the long hours on the road. He gave me a half smile but didn't say much. Then he added something strange. "You won't believe what I saw, hundreds of headless dogs on the road. I've been seeing them for the last 40 miles. Their bodies just laying there, no heads anywhere." I blinked at him, unsure if he was joking or if exhaustion was playing tricks on him. "What? Dude, you need sleep. You're seeing things." He shook his head, his face pale, but he didn't argue. "I'm serious," he said quietly, his voice almost hollow. There were so many of them. I didn't think much of it. We were both tired, and I figured he just needed rest. But I was so wrong. As I started driving, the highway opened up before me, wide and empty, the kind of empty that felt eerie at night. The road was winding through vast stretches of open land, and at first, everything seemed normal. But then it hit me. I saw the first one, a small chihuahua, lifeless on the shoulder of the freeway. Its body lay there, still and unmoving, with no head. The absence of the head was what made it strange, unnatural. I slowed down, staring at it in disbelief, wondering if it was just some twisted trick of the eyes. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my brain. But then, I saw another one. A Doberman this time, with its body crumpled in the grass at the side of the road. No head. The same eerie sight. And another. And another. They seemed to appear out of nowhere, scattered across the road in such regularity that I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that something was horribly wrong. From Chihuahuas to Rottweilers, from Dachshunds to Great Danes, their lifeless, headless bodies were spread out over the highway, like some kind of grotesque pattern. I tried to push the thought away, but I couldn't. The scene was too surreal, too horrifying. The longer I drove, the more I saw. It wasn't just a few dogs, it was hundreds. Literally hundreds of them, scattered along the freeway, their heads nowhere to be found. Some of the bodies had been there for a while, stiff and starting to decay. Others were fresh, their fur still shiny and new, as if they had just been dropped there moments ago. I felt the blood drain from my face. My stomach churned, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. There was something deeply unsettling about the sight of those dogs, something that didn't just feel wrong but unnatural. How could there be so many of them? And why were their heads missing? I tried to keep my focus on the road, but I couldn't ignore the gruesome sight in my peripheral vision. It felt like I was driving through some twisted nightmare, one that kept getting worse the longer I stayed in it. The images kept flashing in front of me, decapitated dog after decapitated dog, each one more horrific than the last. At some point, I realized my friend wasn't just delusional. He had been seeing the same thing, and that realization made the whole situation even worse. It wasn't a trick of the mind. We had both seen the same thing, with no explanation for it. How could this be happening? Was there something out there, something human, behind all this? Someone doing this to these innocent animals? It didn't make sense, and it made my skin crawl. For what felt like forever, I drove. I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to acknowledge what was happening around me. But after about 60 miles of seeing the same horrifying scene, I couldn't take it anymore. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing. The weight of it all was too much. I couldn't just keep driving. I had to stop. I pulled off at the next exit, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. I drove into a rest area, surrounded by other cars and trucks that had stopped for a break. I parked quickly and, without a second thought, ran to the bathroom. I couldn't even make it inside. I just leaned against the wall, throwing up into the nearest trash can. I remember feeling dizzy, like the world had tilted sideways. I could barely catch my breath, my chest tight with panic. It took me a few minutes to regain my composure, and even then, the images of the headless dogs wouldn't leave me. I washed my face with cold water, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My hands were still shaking. I didn't even want to think about what I had just witnessed. But I had to. I had to process it. I couldn't just pretend like nothing had happened. I stepped outside, taking a deep breath of fresh air, hoping to clear the fog in my mind. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was calming, but it couldn't drown out the horrors I had just seen. I walked back to the car slowly, my legs feeling weak. Ellie, our dog, was sleeping soundly in the back seat, completely unaware of what had just happened. I was thankful for that, but a part of me wondered if she had seen something I hadn't. I didn't talk much after that. Neither did my friend. We drove on in silence, our minds haunted by the images of those poor dogs. The rest of the drive was a blur. It felt like we were in some kind of suspended reality, like the world outside the car was a place we couldn't escape. I don't know what happened out there on that stretch of highway. I don't know who, or what, was responsible for those decapitated dogs. All I know is that it was real, and it was terrifying. The idea that someone, or something, could do something so horrific and leave such a trail of destruction behind without anyone ever knowing, is something I'll never be able to understand. The next day, we continued our journey, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see something following us. But there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching on ahead, like nothing had ever happened. I don't talk about what happened that day. I don't think I ever will. It's not something I can explain, and it's not something I want to think about again. But every now and then, when I drive down a lonely stretch of road, I can't help but glance nervously at the shoulder. And I wonder, what was really going on out there? What did we really see? It was late on a cool summer evening when my girlfriend and I decided to visit the Obed National Wild and Scenic River in Wartburg, Tennessee. It was meant to be a quiet getaway, a peaceful trip to explore nature, far away from the city noise. Wartburg, a small town that barely made it on the map, didn't have much to offer, except for the river and the serenity that came with it. The only hotel in town wasn't exactly a five-star establishment. Its exterior was run down, with old mattresses scattered outside as if forgotten relics of better times. But we weren't there for the hotel. We were there to experience the river, and we were excited about it. We had spent the day hiking around and taking in the scenery, and now it was time to head back. The night had settled in, and the rain had started to fall lightly, creating a soft, rhythmic sound against the roof of the car. We were on a back road, one of those narrow, winding highways that stretch out endlessly through forests, with barely a house in sight. It was the kind of road where the only light came from the headlights of our car, casting long, thin beams into the thick trees that lined the roadside. At around 2 a.m., we had been driving for what felt like forever. The rain was still falling, and the road was slick with moisture. There was no one else in sight. We hadn't passed another vehicle in what seemed like an hour. We were completely alone. The atmosphere felt strange, isolating, and for some reason, I had the creeping feeling that something wasn't right. We came up on a curved bridge, the creek below it barely visible through the dark and the rain. As we rounded the corner and crossed the bridge, something strange caught my eye. There, sitting casually on the concrete guardrail, was a man. He was just sitting there, seemingly out of place, in the middle of nowhere, at this ungodly hour in the rain. He looked completely ordinary, maybe in his 20s, wearing a plaid shirt, his dark hair damp from the rain. There was nothing about him that screamed danger, but the sheer absurdity of the situation. No other cars for miles, pouring rain, and then this guy sitting on the bridge made my stomach tighten. We both saw him at the same time, and our reaction was instinctive. We both said, "What the hell?" as the car passed by. He didn't move, just sat there, staring at us as we went by. I felt a chill creep down my spine, but I didn't slow down. Neither of us said anything more. The weirdness of the situation made it hard to process, so we just continued driving. For the next 20 minutes, we drove in silence. The rain had let up a little, but the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no signs of civilization anywhere. The car's headlights barely illuminated the trees that lined the road. We weren't even sure where we were anymore. We had been following Google Maps, but the signal kept cutting in and out, leaving us unsure of our exact location. It felt like we were lost, driving through a patchwork of back roads with no clear direction. Then, Google Maps instructed us to take a right at an intersection. The road was dark, and the only option was straight or right, so I followed the direction. I instantly regretted it. The road went from asphalt to gravel to dirt almost immediately, and the path ahead became more and more treacherous. The trees crowded the sides of the road, and in places, the road seemed to disappear into a field, barely visible tire tracks marking where others had driven before. It felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. I was driving a small Honda, and I kept worrying that if we stopped for any reason, say a deer, I would get stuck in the mud. I wasn't used to driving on these kinds of roads, and the uncertainty of what was ahead started to make my heart race. We drove for about 10 minutes, the road getting worse with every passing second. Then, the inevitable happened. The road dead-ended in thick brush and a massive fallen tree. It was clear no one had come through here for years. Not a soul had driven this way. I cursed under my breath. There was no way to turn around here, but I had no choice but to back up and try to get back to the main road. The gravel was slick with rain, and I had long since turned off the traction control because I knew it would only make things worse. My heart was pounding in my chest as I slowly started to back the car uphill. The wheels spun for what felt like forever, though it was probably only 5 or 10 seconds. Finally, they caught, and we made our way back to the original road. I turned off Google Maps, fed up with it, and we started heading back. But here's where things took a terrifying turn. Just as I was about to get back to the gravel road, something blocked our path. A medium-sized tree had fallen directly in front of us. The strangest part, the tree wasn't there when we passed earlier. It hadn't fallen during the rainstorm. No, this tree had been dragged into place, creating an impassable barrier. The way it lay across the road didn't make sense. I could see the tire ruts in the dirt where it had been dragged, almost like someone had intentionally placed it there to block us. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. My mind raced. Who could have done this? How had they seen us? Why would anyone want to trap us out here? The woods around us were thick, and there was no one in sight. I could feel my pulse quicken. We were miles from anywhere, and the idea of being stuck out here, with no cell service and no way to communicate, sent a wave of panic through me. I grabbed the spotlight from the back seat, my hands trembling. I got out of the car and shined the light into the woods, scanning the trees. Nothing. I walked around the car and shone the light up the road, but there was still nothing. My mind kept racing. Was there someone out there? Had someone seen us? Had we just walked into something we shouldn't have? I rushed back to the car, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and quickly dragged the tree out of the way. The whole time, I felt like something was watching us, but when I glanced around, the woods were silent, save for the sound of rain dripping from the trees. I jumped back into the car, slammed the door, and quickly drove up the road, back onto the main highway. We finally made it to the shitty hotel in Wartburg, where we collapsed into bed, exhausted and shaken. But the images of that road, the dragged tree, and the sense that something wasn't right lingered in my mind long after we arrived. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the locals were playing a prank, seeing a couple of lost outsiders and having a bit of fun. Or maybe there were hunters in the woods who decided to mess with us. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had wandered into something far darker. The whole experience left me feeling uneasy, like we had narrowly escaped something much worse than a prank. Later, I told my girlfriend about the tree and how it had been dragged into place. She looked at me in disbelief, but after everything we had gone through that night, I could tell she felt the same unease I did. She said, "I'm just glad we're out of there." I didn't know what to think anymore, but one thing was for sure. We were lucky to make it out of that place. Whatever had happened, I'll never forget the feeling of driving through that dark, rain-soaked road, and the eerie thought that we weren't as alone as we thought we were. It was late October when my boyfriend and I decided to go on a camping trip in a remote part of Canada. We had been looking for an escape from the hustle and bustle of our daily lives, and the thought of getting away from everything in the wilderness seemed like the perfect plan. We had set up camp in a secluded spot deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, and the only sounds were the rustling of the trees in the wind and the occasional bird call. The weather was far from ideal. It had been raining on and off since we arrived, and the temperature had dropped significantly, making the air feel colder than it should have for this time of year. The persistent drizzle made everything damp and uncomfortable, but we were determined to make the most of it. We decided to take a hike up a steep trail to a lookout point, hoping the physical activity would warm us up. The trail was challenging, winding through dense forest, and we were the only ones on it. There were no other cars at the trailhead, and we hadn't seen anyone else camping or hiking in the area, which made it feel even more isolated. As we ascended, the trees around us grew thicker, and the misty rain combined with the cool air created an eerie atmosphere. Every step we took was met with the sound of crunching leaves beneath our boots, and the occasional drip of water falling from the trees. After about an hour of hiking, we reached the lookout point. The view was breathtaking, with the forest stretching out for miles, but the weather made it hard to truly enjoy it. The clouds were low and dark, the rain continued to fall, and the chill in the air cut through our clothes. We didn't stay long before deciding to head back down the trail. We started our descent, and by this time, the temperature had dropped even more. The rain had become steadier, and we were getting soaked. I was trying to focus on the path ahead, watching my step carefully to avoid slipping, but something made me look behind me. At first, I didn't believe my eyes. There, walking a few steps behind us, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. She was alone, walking in the rain, wearing nothing but a t-shirt and what looked like a pair of shorts. The cold was unbearable, and the rain was coming down harder now, so I couldn't fathom why a child would be out here by herself, especially dressed so lightly for the weather. I stopped in my tracks, glancing over at my boyfriend. He hadn't noticed her yet, so I quietly pointed behind us. His eyes widened when he saw her. She was walking so casually, her small figure barely visible through the mist of the rain, and what struck me most was that she didn't seem to notice us at all. She wasn't asking for help or looking confused. She was just walking along, humming to herself, completely unfazed by the cold or the downpour. We kept walking, but I couldn't shake the unease building in my chest. I kept stealing glances behind me, half expecting the girl to disappear, but each time I looked, she was still there, a few paces behind us. She wasn't walking in a straight line. At times, she would stop, twirl around, and then start skipping, all the while humming softly. It was almost as if she was in her own world, completely oblivious to the harsh weather around her, the slippery ground, and the fact that she was alone in the middle of nowhere. We tried not to let the situation freak us out. Maybe she had gotten separated from her parents. Maybe she was with a group further up the trail. But the more I thought about it, the less plausible that seemed. We had been hiking for a couple of hours, and there was no one else around. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere. We continued walking down the trail, and with each glance over my shoulder, the girl seemed to be getting closer. It wasn't that she was speeding up, it was more like she was just matching our pace. But then something happened. I looked back one more time, and she was gone, completely vanished. There was no sign of her anywhere on the trail behind us. No footsteps in the mud, no sign of her t-shirt or bare legs in the rain. She had simply disappeared. My heart was racing now, and my boyfriend and I exchanged a look of confusion and anxiety. Where had she gone? How had she disappeared so quickly? We stopped walking for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. I felt a tight knot in my stomach. The girl had been there, and now she was gone. It didn't make any sense. We continued down the trail in silence, neither of us sure of what to say. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the little girl behind us again, but there was nothing. The forest seemed unnervingly quiet now, the usual sounds of wildlife and rain almost muted. Every step we took felt heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. By the time we made it back to our campsite, we were both on edge. We hadn't seen another soul on the trail the entire time, and the rain had only gotten heavier as we walked. I couldn't stop thinking about the girl. What was she doing out there alone? How had she been so unaffected by the cold? And where had she gone? It didn't add up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We sat in the tent, huddling together for warmth, and I found myself replaying the moment over and over in my head. We should have stopped and asked her if she was okay. We should have called out to her. But in that moment, I had been too stunned to act. I regretted it now, but it was too late. The rest of the night passed in an uneasy silence. The rain continued to fall outside, and the wind howled through the trees. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting back to the little girl, her pale face, and her hauntingly calm demeanor. It was as if she had come out of nowhere and disappeared just as quickly, leaving only an unsettling feeling in her wake. The next morning, we packed up camp and made our way back to the car. The rain had stopped, but the chill in the air lingered. We tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but it was hard to forget what had happened. We had been out in the middle of nowhere, with no other hikers or campers around, and then, out of the blue, there had been this child, lost in the woods in the most inappropriate clothing for the weather. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. I've thought about it a lot since then. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain it. It wasn't like anything I've ever experienced before. Part of me wonders if I had imagined it, if it was some kind of trick of the mind from the cold and the isolation. But then I remember the way she had hummed to herself, the way she had skipped along behind us without a care in the world, and I can't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong about the whole thing. I only wish now that I had spoken to her, that I had done something to make sure she was okay. I think about her often, and I can't help but wonder if she was really out there alone, or if something else was going on. Whatever it was, it's something I'll never forget. My dad always talks about the strange thing that happened to him one cold winter night when he was a teenager. It's one of those stories that stuck with him, like an itch he could never quite scratch. He grew up in a tiny rural village in central Ohio during the 1980s. Back then, the town was barely a speck on the map, and the roads outside of town were long, dark stretches that seemed to go on forever with nothing but cornfields and flat land on either side. It's a place where, if you drove out at night, the world would feel like it disappeared completely. The streets empty, the houses few and far between, and the only light from your headlights cutting through the thick, enveloping darkness. It was around 11 p.m. or so, one of those late nights after a marching band event, and my dad's mom, his mother, who I always called Grandma, was driving him home. They'd been out in the town, which was maybe a few miles away, and it was the kind of night that didn't feel unusual, not at first. The radio was quiet in the car, and the only sound was the low hum of the tires on the old asphalt. There was no moon that night, and the clouds overhead had blanketed the sky, leaving the world below feeling suffocatingly dark. The road they were driving down was a long, unlit stretch that cut through the countryside. On either side of them were wide, flat cornfields that seemed endless in the distance. It was winter, and the fields were barren, just bare, frozen ground with the occasional patch of dead, yellowed stalks sticking out from the earth. There weren't any houses or streetlights for miles. The only sign of life came from the occasional tree that had been stunted by the freezing cold. They were about halfway down the road when they saw her. My dad says it happened so suddenly that at first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. There, walking along the edge of the ditch that ran parallel to the road, was a woman. She was barefoot, walking through the icy wet grass, with no shoes to protect her from the cold. She was wearing nothing but a thin, white nightgown, the kind you would expect to see someone wear when they're just waking up or getting ready for bed. The strangest part, she didn't seem to notice them at all. No sign of distress, no begging for help. She wasn't waving her arms or trying to flag them down. She was just walking, barefoot, through the ditch, her thin nightgown billowing slightly in the wind, walking slowly and deliberately in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where you couldn't imagine anyone being out there at all, let alone in the dead of night with the freezing air biting at their skin. As they drove past, my dad and Grandma both looked at her, almost in disbelief. The woman didn't look back at them. She didn't even seem to acknowledge their presence. She just kept walking, humming to herself as if she didn't have a care in the world. My dad remembers the strange sound of her humming cutting through the silence of the night, like a distant melody floating in the wind. He said it was the kind of thing that made you feel uneasy, like something wasn't quite right, but you couldn't put your finger on it. It wasn't until they had passed her that the feeling hit them both. Something was off about that woman. My dad said the hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his stomach turned with unease. His grandma, normally so practical and down-to-earth, looked over at him with wide eyes. The woman's appearance, the way she was just walking there, out in the cold with no regard for her safety, set something off in both of them. Something didn't feel right. They both felt a strange compulsion to turn around, to make sure the woman wasn't in danger. Maybe she was sick. Maybe she had wandered away from her home or gotten lost. They couldn't ignore the pit in their stomachs that told them she was in trouble. She was so pale, almost unnaturally so, that it made her seem sickly, like she'd been bedridden for days or even weeks. The pallor of her skin was strikingly white, even under the dim glow of the car's headlights, and it looked almost translucent in the way that made it difficult to look at for too long. Without saying much, my dad's grandma made a decision. They needed to go back. They needed to check on her, make sure she was okay. It wasn't even a question. She wasn't the kind of woman to ignore someone in need, and the feeling that something wasn't right gnawed at them both as they turned the car around, driving back down the dark road. They didn't talk much during that drive, the silence hanging heavy between them as the car's headlights pierced the thick darkness. They could both feel the cold creeping in, pressing against the windows, as the rain began to fall lightly, the sound of it pattering against the roof and windshield. When they reached the spot where they had seen the woman, they slowed down, scanning the side of the road. The car's headlights swept over the grass, the frozen earth, the ditch that she had been walking along, but there was nothing there. No woman, no sign of her at all. They drove past the area a few more times, making sure they didn't miss anything. They pulled over at one point and got out, walking along the ditch in the freezing cold rain, calling out into the night for the woman. But there was no answer, no trace of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The ditch was shallow, no more than 4 feet deep in some places, but the terrain was flat and barren. If she had run into the fields, they would have seen her. There were no buildings nearby, no trees that could have obscured her, no place for her to hide. The The field stretched out for miles, unbroken and empty. There was nowhere she could have gone that quickly. My dad and grandma eventually gave up. The fear in their stomachs was replaced by confusion, and then a lingering sense of dread. They didn't understand what had happened. Where had the woman gone? Had she run off? Had she disappeared into the night, somehow evading them? Or had they encountered something else? Even now, years later, my dad still talks about that night as if it was something he can't quite explain, something that haunts him. He feels certain they saw a ghost, a figure that had somehow appeared out of nowhere, walking in the cold night, barefoot and pale. A woman who seemed too out of place, too strange to be real. My grandma, though, has always been practical, and she refuses to believe in ghosts. She suggested, more than once, that the woman might have been a sleepwalker, someone who had wandered out of their home, startled by the headlights of the car, and hidden when they drove by. But my dad still isn't convinced. To him, the whole experience feels like a warning, like something that never quite made sense, but stuck with him like a memory he couldn't shake. He still wonders what happened to that woman, whether she was real or just a figment of his imagination, or maybe something worse. What haunts him, even more than the encounter itself, is the question he can never answer. What if they had stopped? What if they had tried to help her? Would it have made a difference? Would they have been able to save her? Or would they have been caught in something far darker than they ever imagined? It was a cold, rainy night in the middle of October. I was on my way home from a work trip, driving down a long stretch of highway, and the road was completely empty. There weren't any other cars, no streetlights, just the dull glow of my headlights cutting through the darkness. I had been on the road for hours, and the drive had started to feel endless. I was exhausted, and the only thing I wanted to do was get home and go to bed. I turned on the radio, but the static mixed with the rain tapping against my windshield made it hard to focus on anything. The only sounds I could hear were the hum of my tires on the wet road and the constant downpour. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to push through the fatigue, knowing I had a few more hours before I could reach home. That's when I noticed the headlights behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's normal to see a car behind you when you're driving on a highway. But as the car started gaining on me, I began to feel a little uneasy. It wasn't the normal pattern of a car trying to pass me. This car stayed right behind me, even when I sped up. And I mean really sped up. I thought, maybe I'm just paranoid. It's late. Maybe I'm just tired. But the car stayed right behind me, just tailing me, never slowing down. I glanced at my rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. This wasn't a regular car. It was black, but not like any normal black car I'd seen. The paint was matte, and it was sleek, almost unnaturally dark, like it was absorbing the light around it. I couldn't make out any details of the car's shape, but what bothered me the most was the lack of any visible markings or plates. The headlights were blinding, almost too bright, and they seemed to cut through the rain and mist as though they were focused directly on me. I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't like I had ever had a car follow me like this. My instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. I tried to focus on the road ahead of me, but the car kept following, never changing its distance. It was too close for comfort. I had never been the type of person to panic easily, but at that moment, I felt my heart start racing. My palms started sweating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to test it. I started speeding up, trying to shake off whatever this car was. I pushed the pedal harder, but the black car stayed right there, just behind me. It didn't matter how fast I went. This car was keeping up. It was like it was waiting for me to make a move. I glanced over at the side of the road. There was nothing around, just miles and miles of empty highway and dark woods. I was alone, and the rain kept coming down, heavy and relentless. The more I tried to speed up, the more the car seemed to cling to me. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for, but I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get away. My hands gripped the wheel tighter, and I slammed my foot on the accelerator again, this time going even faster. The car behind me followed suit, still maintaining its position. By now, I was sure it wasn't just a coincidence. I had tried everything, and still, the black car was there, right behind me. I started to feel trapped. I didn't want to pull over, but I had no choice. The next exit was coming up, and I decided to take it. I veered off the highway and onto a smaller road, hoping to lose the black car. As I took the turn, I glanced back at the rearview mirror, but the car was still there, still right behind me. My heart skipped a beat. How could it be following me so perfectly? There was no way it was this persistent for just a coincidence. I pulled off the road into a small gas station parking lot. I parked my car and sat there for a moment, catching my breath. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was late, I was tired, and maybe I had overreacted. I glanced into the rearview mirror again, and that's when I realized the black car was gone. It was like it vanished. No car in sight, no headlights shining, nothing. I stared out the window into the night, confused. I didn't understand how it had happened. The parking lot wasn't big, and there was no way the car could have passed without me seeing it. I looked around, but there was no sign of it. I felt like I was in some kind of dream. What had just happened? Was it my imagination? Was I just seeing things? I sat there for a moment, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, unsure of what to do. I could feel my pulse still racing. It didn't make any sense. After a few minutes, I decided to get out of the car and check. Maybe I could see something, anything, that would explain it. But when I stepped outside, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air felt heavy, like something was lurking just out of sight. I walked around the gas station, keeping an eye on the dark highway, but there was nothing. The place was deserted, the only sounds being the distant hum of the wind and the soft patter of rain against the pavement. The black car didn't reappear. I was still trying to wrap my head around what had happened when I finally decided to leave. I didn't want to stay there longer than I had to. I climbed back into my car, started the engine, and slowly pulled out of the parking lot. I drove for another few miles, constantly checking my mirrors, half expecting to see the black car again. But there was nothing. The road stretched out in front of me, empty and quiet, and I eventually made it back to the main highway. As I continued on my drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My mind kept replaying the events, and I kept asking myself if I had imagined it. The car, where had it gone? Why had it followed me like that? It didn't make any sense. By the time I got home, the feeling had started to fade, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The black car, the headlights, the way it just disappeared. I had never been so unsettled by something so simple before. To this day, I still think about that night. I can't explain what happened, and I don't want to. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I'll never forget the sensation of being followed down that empty, rainy highway by a car that shouldn't have been there. Something about it didn't feel right, and it still haunts me every time I drive alone at night. It was a quiet night, the kind of night where everything seems to slow down and the world feels far away. The kind of night where you could almost convince yourself you were the only person left in the world. The road stretched ahead of me, the headlights illuminating the wet asphalt, and the rhythmic sound of the tires on the road was almost hypnotic. I had been driving for hours, trying to make it home after a long day, and I was more than ready to be out of the car and in the comfort of my own bed. The rain had been coming down steadily since I hit the highway. It wasn't too heavy, just enough to make the world outside seem hazy, a blurry landscape of dark trees and fields. The road was mostly empty, with only the occasional passing car. I had been on this stretch of highway before, but something felt different tonight. Maybe it was the rain, or maybe it was just the tiredness from the long drive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I was alone, the car was quiet except for the soft hum of the engine, and the rain tapping against the windshield. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, just past 11 p.m. The only thing I wanted was to get home, but the road seemed endless, stretching out in front of me with no end in sight. It was about then that I noticed something odd in the distance. At first, I thought it was just the rain playing tricks on me, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person standing in the ditch by the side of the road. A woman, barefoot, wearing nothing but a thin nightgown. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately felt uneasy. Now, you have to understand, this was a very rural part of the highway. There weren't any towns or houses for miles. The only thing around were vast fields and the occasional tree. It was well past midnight, and the temperature had dropped significantly. The rain was cold, and yet there she was, barefoot, in a nightgown, standing motionless in the ditch. I slowed down as I approached her, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. She wasn't moving, just standing there in the rain, her head slightly tilted down. As I drove past, I couldn't help but look at her out of the corner of my eye. Her skin was pale, too pale, almost unnaturally so, and her hair was wet and sticking to her face. She didn't seem to acknowledge my car at all, just standing there, as if she didn't even notice it. I couldn't stop staring, but there was something strange about the whole situation. Something about the way she was standing there, so still, so quiet, felt wrong. I tried to push the feeling aside, thinking maybe she was just someone stranded, waiting for help. But who would be out there, alone at this hour in the rain, with no car and no flashlight? It didn't make sense. I continued driving, my mind racing, but I couldn't shake the image of her from my head. She hadn't even moved when I passed. She hadn't called out for help, hadn't looked up at me as if she needed assistance. She had just stood there, in the dark, in the rain, looking almost lifeless. As I drove further down the road, I started to think that maybe I should turn around and check on her. Something didn't sit right with me. What if she was in trouble? What if she was sick or lost? I couldn't just leave her out there in the middle of nowhere. I made a U-turn and started driving back down the road. The rain was coming down harder now, and the road was slick. My headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the ditches on either side, but there was no sign of her. I kept my eyes on the sides of the road as I drove, my heart racing. Where could she have gone? I reached the spot where I had seen her standing, but there was no one there. The ditch was empty, and the rain kept falling, making everything look even more desolate. I drove a little further down the road, thinking maybe I had missed her, but there was nothing. No sign of her at all. I pulled over to the side of the road, feeling more confused than ever. I sat there for a moment, just staring out into the rain. Maybe she had just wandered off, I thought. Maybe she had been waiting for someone to pick her up, or maybe she had just gotten lost. But something about it all still didn't feel right. I couldn't stop thinking about how she had been standing there, so still, without moving, without saying a word. I checked the clock on the dashboard again, just past midnight. I was exhausted, and I had been driving for hours. I thought about getting back on the road, but the feeling of unease was still there, gnawing at me. I couldn't shake the image of her pale face, and the way she hadn't seemed to care about the car passing by. I took a deep breath and turned the car back on. I didn't want to sit out there in the rain any longer. I needed to get home. But as I started to drive again, my thoughts kept drifting back to her. I had to know what had happened to her. It didn't make sense. I decided to take a different route, one that would take me through a small town up ahead. Maybe someone there had seen her, or maybe she had gone into one of the nearby houses. At this point, I just needed answers. My mind wouldn't let it go. I drove for a while, trying to clear my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The streets were empty, and the rain showed no signs of letting up. I passed a few houses, but there was no sign of life anywhere. The town was quiet, too quiet, as if everyone was hiding from the storm. I decided to pull over in front of a small convenience store, hoping to find someone who could tell me if they knew anything about the woman I had seen. I got out of the car and walked up to the door, but it was locked. I knocked, but no one answered. I tried calling the number on the window, but the phone just rang and rang. I stood there for a moment, feeling the cold rain soak through my jacket. It was as if the whole town had gone silent, as if no one wanted to acknowledge what I had just seen. I couldn't explain it, but the eerie feeling was growing stronger with every passing second. I turned around and got back into the car. I drove back to the highway, trying to push the whole experience out of my mind. The woman in the ditch, the strange emptiness of the town, it all felt wrong. But I couldn't figure out what it was. I just couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened that I would never understand. As I continued down the highway, the rain began to slow, and the night grew quieter. The world seemed to settle, but I couldn't let go of the memory of that woman standing in the ditch. I don't know who she was or where she went, but I'll never forget the feeling that something wasn't right about that night. I still think about it sometimes when I drive down lonely roads at night. Maybe she was just someone lost and in need of help. Maybe she was a sleepwalker or someone with a strange story of their own. But I still can't shake the thought that there was something else going on that night. Something I'll never understand. And every time I drive down a long, empty stretch of road, I wonder if I'll ever see her again. The road stretched ahead, endless and empty, with only the soft glow of my headlights cutting through the heavy rain. The weather had been bad all day. It had rained off and on, and now it was almost a steady downpour, soaking everything in its path. I had been driving for hours, heading back home from a visit to a friend's house. The drive was long, especially in this rural part of the country, and I had hoped the rain would let up, but it didn't. It just kept falling, making everything look blurred, like the world was hidden behind a watery veil. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was just past 11 p.m. I had a few more miles to go before I reached the main road that would take me home, but the loneliness of the highway was starting to get to me. The road was empty, the kind of emptiness that makes you feel isolated, like you're the only person left on Earth. There were no streetlights, no other cars, just fields and trees on either side. The only sound was the steady hum of my tires on the wet asphalt. As I drove, I started to notice how quiet everything seemed. The only movement was the rain, tapping softly on the roof of the car. The headlights lit up patches of the road, but most of the landscape beyond them was just dark and unknown. I wasn't really scared, but the isolation was unsettling. In the back of my mind, I kept telling myself to stay alert, that the road was long and the night was still young. About half an hour passed before I saw something in the distance. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the rain, some strange shadow or blur caused by the headlights reflecting off the wet road. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person, standing in the ditch by the side of the road. A woman. Now, in a place like this, where there's nothing but flat farmland for miles, seeing someone standing alone by the side of the road in the middle of the night didn't make sense. There weren't any towns nearby, not for miles. There were no houses, no businesses. Just the open road and fields on either side. I slowed down, unsure of what to make of it. She was barefoot. Her feet were covered in mud, and she wasn't wearing a coat or anything warm. She was wearing only a thin nightgown, drenched from the rain. The nightgown clung to her body, and I could see how pale she was, her skin almost white under the harsh light of my headlights. She didn't look up at me as I passed, just kept walking along the edge of the ditch, her head lowered slightly. I felt a chill run through me as I passed. It didn't make sense. Who would be out here, alone, in the middle of the night, barefoot, wearing nothing but a nightgown? And why was she walking along the side of the road, in the rain, without even a flashlight or a coat? My mind started racing, trying to come up with an explanation. As I glanced at her through the window, I noticed how still she was. She didn't seem to notice the car or the headlights, like she was in a world of her own. There was no sense of urgency in her movements, no sign that she was lost or scared. It was as though she was simply walking, without any real direction or purpose. I tried to convince myself that maybe she was just someone who had gotten lost or was stranded, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I drove a little further down the road, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. But I couldn't get her out of my head. There was something about the way she just stood there, so still and quiet, that felt off. I looked in my rearview mirror, but the woman was no longer in sight. I couldn't tell if she had stopped or if I had just passed her without realizing it. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like I had to turn around. Something was nagging at me, telling me I needed to check on her. What if she was lost? What if she was in danger? I couldn't just leave her out there, alone, in the middle of nowhere, especially in this weather. I made a decision. I took the next turn and looped back around, heading back to where I had seen her. My heart was racing a little now, the feeling of unease growing stronger with every passing second. What if she wasn't just some lost traveler? What if there was something more to this? My mind kept running through different scenarios, trying to figure out what I had seen. As I drove back down the road, I could feel the tension building. The rain was coming down harder now, and the road was slick. The wipers swished back and forth, clearing the rain from the windshield, but it felt like they weren't doing enough to clear the heaviness in the air. I reached the spot where I had seen her standing in the ditch, but there was no sign of her. I slowed down, my headlights scanning the area, looking for any sign of movement, but the ditch was empty. I felt a wave of confusion wash over me. Where had she gone? There was no way she could have disappeared that quickly. I drove a little further, hoping I had just missed her, but there was nothing. No sign of her anywhere. I pulled over to the side of the road, trying to gather my thoughts. What was going on? Could she have walked into the fields? But the land around here was flat and barren, especially this time of year. The fields were empty, and there were no trees or obstacles for her to hide behind. I sat there for a few minutes, just staring at the road. It didn't make sense. How could she have just disappeared like that? I decided to get out of the car and walk back to the spot where I had seen her. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe I could find some trace of her. But when I got out of the car and walked toward the ditch, there was nothing. Not even a footprint in the wet ground. I looked around, scanning the area, but all I could see were empty fields stretching out in the distance. There were no houses, no lights, no signs of life anywhere. I even walked a little further down the road, thinking maybe she had walked off in the rain, but still there was nothing. The rain was pouring down harder now, soaking my clothes and making everything slippery, but I couldn't stop myself from looking. I returned to the car, my mind spinning. Where had she gone? Who was she? And why had she been out there, alone, in the middle of nowhere? The whole situation felt wrong, and the feeling of unease that had started when I first saw her was now a full-blown panic in my chest. I didn't know what had just happened, but something told me I had just experienced something I couldn't explain. I sat in the car for a while, not knowing what to do. The rain continued to fall, the only sound in the darkness. I had no idea where she had gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was meant to see her, that something important had just happened. Eventually, I decided to continue my drive. I needed to get home, and there was nothing else I could do. But as I drove, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman. Her pale skin, her nightgown, the way she didn't even acknowledge the car passing by. The whole thing felt like it was meant to be unsettling, like I wasn't supposed to understand what had just happened. To this day, I still think about it sometimes. Who was she? What happened to her? Was she just a lost traveler, or was there something more to the story? I may never know, but I can't help but wonder, every time I drive alone down a long, empty road, if I'll ever encounter her again. If I'll see that pale face in the rain, walking quietly along the side of the road, the woman in the ditch. I don't think I'll ever forget her. It was the kind of night that made you feel like the world was moving in slow motion, like time was stretching out and you were the only one moving through it. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, the sound of it pattering against the roof of the car as I drove down a long, desolate stretch of highway. I wasn't in a hurry. I was just trying to get home after a long day, my mind somewhere between the past and the future, absorbed in the quiet hum of the car. I glanced at the clock, almost 11:30 p.m. It felt later than that, though. The road ahead was nothing but a dark ribbon of asphalt stretching out into the unknown, and I had no idea how many miles I had left to go. There were no signs of civilization, not a single light in sight. No houses, no streetlights, no other cars. Just endless fields on either side, their shapes barely visible in the dark, the rain falling in sheets. The headlights of my car barely made a dent in the inky blackness that surrounded me. I was used to driving on these roads, rural, isolated, the kind of place where everything felt far removed from the rest of the world. But tonight, for some reason, it felt even quieter than usual. The air was thick with the sound of the rain, the world muted, like it was holding its breath. I had been driving for a while now, and I was starting to get a little uncomfortable. The emptiness was starting to get to me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that it was just the late hour and the rain playing tricks on me. But the more I drove, the more I felt that sense of unease settling in, like I was being watched, even though I knew I was alone out here. That's when I saw her. At first, it didn't register. I was too busy focusing on the road ahead, trying to keep my attention sharp in the dark and the rain. But then, in the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It was too far ahead to make out clearly, but there was definitely something, or someone standing there. At first, I thought it might be another car, but there were no headlights, no indication of any other vehicles around. Just that dark shape standing at the edge of the ditch. I slowed down instinctively, my heart picking up speed as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The woman was standing in the ditch parallel to the road, her figure almost swallowed up by the darkness. She was barefoot, which struck me as odd, especially considering the cold weather. The rain was pouring down, and the temperature was well below freezing. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, barefoot, in the dead of night? I could see her more clearly as I got closer. She was wearing nothing but a thin nightgown, soaked through by the rain. Her pale skin was almost glowing in the dim light from my headlights. She didn't look up at the car as I approached, didn't wave or move in any way that seemed human. She was just walking slowly, like she didn't even notice I was there, like she was in her own world, unaware of the car driving past. I felt a chill run down my spine as I passed her. I couldn't stop myself from looking in the rearview mirror, my mind racing. Was she lost? How had she ended up here, so far from any place where she could find help? There were no houses nearby, no lights, nothing but the dark, open fields stretching out in every direction. I tried to shake it off. Maybe she was just someone out for a walk, maybe she was a local. But it didn't make sense. Who would walk along the side of a dark road at this time of night? in the middle of a downpour, wearing nothing but a nightgown. I felt the unease creeping up again, a feeling deep in my gut that told me something was wrong. I looked behind me, just to see if she had stopped or moved out of sight. But when I checked the rearview mirror, she was still there, just walking along the edge of the ditch, her head bent down, her steps slow and measured. She didn't seem to notice the car behind her. It was like she was in a trance, moving forward, step by step, without a care in the world. As I drove on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My mind kept circling back to her. What if she was lost? What if she needed help? The thought nagged at me. I couldn't just leave her out there, not knowing who she was or what had brought her to that spot. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself that she was fine, that she was probably just some local who lived nearby. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I made a decision. I had to turn around and check on her. It didn't matter if I was late or if I was just being paranoid. I couldn't leave her out there alone in the rain, especially in such dangerous conditions. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I had to at least try to help. I turned the car around, the tires slipping a little on the wet road. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm. I told myself that everything would be fine, that it was just a simple misunderstanding, that she was just a local out for a walk, and that I was being overdramatic. But the closer I got to where I had seen her, the more my anxiety grew. I slowed down as I approached the spot where she had been walking, but she wasn't there anymore. I looked around, scanning the area with my headlights, but there was no sign of her. No trace of her nightgown, no footprints in the wet ditch. Just the rain and the dark, empty road. I couldn't believe it. Where had she gone? How could she have disappeared so quickly? I drove a little further down the road, hoping I had just missed her, but there was no sign of her anywhere. I pulled over to the side of the road, my mind racing. What had just happened? There was no way she could have just vanished into thin air. I decided to get out of the car, to walk along the ditch, and see if I could find any sign of her. But the rain was coming down harder now, and the cold was biting into my skin as I stepped out into the night. I walked up and down the road, searching the ditch, the fields, looking for any sign of where she had gone. But there was nothing. The fields were flat and barren, and the area around the ditch was open, with no place for someone to hide. I walked for what felt like an eternity, but I found nothing. No sign of footprints, no signs of movement. It was like she had just disappeared. I returned to the car, my heart heavy with confusion. I didn't know what to think. What had I just seen? Had I imagined it? Had she somehow run off and hidden somewhere? Or was there something more to it? I couldn't understand what had happened, but something told me I wasn't going to get any answers that night. I got back in the car and drove away, the rain still pouring down, the sound of it almost deafening. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing there, still walking along the edge of the road. But there was nothing, just the empty road, stretching on into the darkness. To this day, I can't stop thinking about it. Who was she? Where did she go? What was she doing out there, alone, in the middle of the night? I'll never know. But I can't help but feel like something strange happened that night. Something I'll never fully understand. The woman in the ditch. She'll always be with me, a mystery that never quite goes away. Big Bend National Park had always been one of my favorite places. Its vastness, the raw beauty of the desert and mountains, and the sense of isolation drew me in every time. A few years ago, I planned a short trip to hike some of the trails I hadn't yet explored. Most of the trip had been uneventful, peaceful really. The kind of calm that reminds you why you love hiking in the first place. But what happened on my third day out is something I'll never forget. That morning, I decided to take it easy. The first 2 days had been filled with longer hikes, and my legs were feeling the strain. I figured a short hike to a scenic overlook would be perfect. The window trail seemed like a good choice, a manageable distance with a rewarding view at the end. It's an out-and-back trail, not a loop, so I'd follow the same path to return. The thought of a quiet, simple hike sounded perfect. The day started like any other. I packed some water, a snack, and my small first aid kit. The weather was mild, with a bright sun overhead and a gentle breeze that kept the desert heat at bay. As I set out on the trail, I noticed a few of the warning signs scattered along the way. Reminders that this was wild country, home to mountain lions and black bears. I always read them, even though I'd never encountered anything dangerous before. They were a reminder to stay alert, though, and as I walked, I let my mind wander to the what-ifs. What would I do if a wildcat crossed my path? Would I freeze? Run? Fight? I thought of all the advice I'd read over the years. Make yourself big, make noise, don't run. I pictured myself in the scenarios, going through the motions in my head. It was an idle way to pass the time. After all, what were the chances I'd actually run into something? These were thoughts you entertained for fun, not because you truly expected to need them. The trail was busy enough that I crossed paths with other hikers every so often. Most of them were heading back toward the trailhead, offering me quick nods or a brief "hey" as we passed. It felt comforting, knowing there were others out there. But as I got closer to the overlook, the foot traffic thinned out. By the time I reached the end of the trail, I was alone. The overlook was stunning, as promised. The trail ended at a narrow gap in the cliffs, framing the desert below like a natural window. The drop-off was sheer, a vertical plummet that made my stomach churn if I leaned too far forward. I sat for a while, soaking it all in. The view, the silence, the faint rustle of wind through the brush. It was moments like this that made every mile worth it. Eventually, the sun climbed higher, and I knew it was time to head back. The return trip was uneventful at first. I retraced my steps along the trail, the landscape familiar, but no less beautiful. As I walked, I fell into a rhythm, the steady crunch of my boots against the dirt keeping time. I passed a few more hikers heading toward the overlook, exchanging quick greetings, but not much else. It wasn't until I was a little over halfway back that I rounded a bend and saw something that made my heart stop. About 20 yards ahead, standing in the middle of the trail, was a black bear. For a moment, I froze, my brain struggling to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. The bear was small, not much bigger than me, and it was grazing, its head down as it sniffed at the ground. My first thought was ridiculous. He's not that big. If there's trouble, I could take him. The thought flickered for barely a second before the reality hit me like a punch to the gut. Where there's a small bear, there's probably a bigger bear, a mother bear. And just as the thought formed, a cub emerged from the brush, waddling up beside the bear on the trail. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just any bear. It was a mother bear with her cub. My chances of taking anything were now zero. I was in trouble, and I knew it. The bear hadn't noticed me yet. She was still grazing, her head down, oblivious to my presence. I stood frozen, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? Run? No, that would trigger her chase instincts. Stay still. That didn't seem like a good idea, either. I needed to do something, anything, to avoid surprising her or giving her a reason to see me as a threat. The trail was narrow here, with a steep incline on one side and a gully full of thick brush on the other. There was nowhere to go but forward or back. My only option was to find a way to make her move. My eyes darted around, searching for something I could use. I spotted a couple of rocks near my feet, each about the size of a softball. I bent down slowly, keeping my eyes on the bear, and picked them up. My hands shook as I clutched the rocks, their weight oddly comforting. If the bear charged, they were the closest thing I had to a weapon. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. All right, I thought, let's see if the scaring thing works. I'd read that loud noises could sometimes scare off bears, especially smaller ones. I raised the rocks and started banging them together, the sharp clack echoing through the quiet canyon. At the same time, I yelled, my voice cracking but loud enough to carry. The bear's head shot up. For a moment, she just stared at me, her dark eyes locking onto mine. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I kept banging the rocks and yelling, taking a tentative step forward. She didn't move. I took another step, the noise growing louder, more frantic. The cub turned and bolted into the brush, disappearing from view. A moment later, the mother bear followed, her movements surprisingly graceful as she bounded off the trail and into the gully. I stood there, frozen, listening to the rustling of branches as the bears moved deeper into the brush. My hands were still clutching the rocks, my knuckles white. Slowly, the rustling faded, and the silence returned. They were gone. I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My legs felt like jelly, and I had to steady myself against the incline to keep from collapsing. The adrenaline coursing through me left me lightheaded, but I knew I couldn't stay there. The bears might come back, or worse, another one might appear. I needed to keep moving. I walked quickly but cautiously, my eyes scanning the trail and the brush around me. Every shadow, every movement in the distance made my pulse spike. The quiet that had felt peaceful earlier now felt oppressive, every sound amplified in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I knew the bears were gone. About 10 minutes later, I ran into a group of hikers heading toward the overlook. They looked calm, chatting amongst themselves, oblivious to what I'd just been through. I stopped to warn them about the bears, but before I could say anything, one of them mentioned they'd already reported the sighting to park rangers. Apparently, the hikers I'd passed earlier had seen the bears too. Relief washed over me. At least the rangers would handle it. I nodded, thanked them, and continued on my way, my pace quickening as the trailhead came into view. When I finally reached the parking lot, I sat down on a bench, my hands still trembling. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. I took a deep breath, the cool evening air soothing my nerves. The fear that had gripped me on the trail began to fade, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude. I'd made it out safely, and so had the bears. That hike was supposed to be a simple, relaxing day. Instead, it became one of the most intense experiences of my life. It reminded me of the wildness of places like Big Bend. Their beauty, yes, but also their danger. I'd always respected the wilderness, but after that day, I respected it even more. The wind whipped against my rain jacket as the sky above Philmont Scout Ranch turned a shade of gray, so dark it looked like dusk, even though it was only mid-afternoon. We'd been hiking for hours that day, moving steadily toward the next campsite. Our group of 7, 6 scouts and 1 adult leader, was spread out along the narrow trail, trudging through the rugged terrain of New Mexico's Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The air, which had been stiflingly hot earlier, had taken on a strange electric chill. I was 14, the same age as most of my friends on the trek. This was my first real adventure far from home, a 7-day, 50-mile journey through some of the most challenging terrain I'd ever faced. I was proud of how prepared I'd been. My boots were broken in, my pack was loaded efficiently, and I had all the right gear. I'd even brought extra rain gear, knowing New Mexico's infamous thunderstorms were a daily occurrence. But nothing could have prepared me for the storm that afternoon. It started with a low rumble in the distance, barely noticeable over the sound of our boots crunching against gravel and dirt. I glanced over my shoulder at our adult leader, Mr. Davis, who was at the back of the line. He nodded in acknowledgement of the sound, but didn't say anything. Thunderstorms were common, after all, and we'd already weathered a few during the trip. I figured this one would pass like the others had, a quick downpour, maybe a flash or two of lightning, and then it'd move on. But this storm was different. The air felt alive, charged in a way I'd never experienced before. The thunder grew louder, and the sky grew darker. The wind picked up, pulling at the trees around us, their branches swaying violently. Then came the rain. It didn't start as a drizzle or even a steady shower. It was as if the clouds had opened up all at once, dumping an ocean of water onto the trail. Within seconds, the dirt beneath our feet turned to slippery mud. The rain pounded against my hood, each drop sounding like a drumbeat. The trail became a series of shallow streams, water rushing downhill, carrying pebbles and debris along with it. "Stop," Mr. Davis shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening roar of the rain. He moved to the front of the group, motioning for us to gather together. "Lightning," he yelled, pointing to the sky. A flash illuminated the mountains around us, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder, so loud it felt like it was splitting the air. My stomach dropped. The storm wasn't just near, it was on top of us. "Lightning position," Mr. Davis commanded, his voice urgent. We all knew what to do. We'd been trained for this. "Spread out. Stay low. Minimize contact with the ground." One by one, we scattered into the clearing beside the trail, each of us finding a spot at least 15 feet from the next person. I dropped my pack and squatted down, balancing on the balls of my feet, my arms wrapped around my knees. The goal was to make yourself as small as possible, reducing the chance of being struck directly or injured by ground currents if lightning hit nearby. The rain was relentless, hammering against my hood and running down my face. My glasses were useless, fogged and streaked with water, so I shoved them into a pocket. I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. The storm seemed to envelop everything. The sound of the rain, the flashes of lightning, the wind whipping through the trees. It was overwhelming, disorienting. From my position, I could see most of my friends. Jacob to my left, crouched with his back to me, and Sarah a bit further to the right. But Kyle, who had been just ahead of me on the trail, was nowhere in sight. A large tree blocked my view of where I thought he'd gone. I squinted through the rain, trying to catch a glimpse of him, but the storm made it impossible. Then it happened. A blinding flash lit up the clearing, so close it turned the world white for a split second. The crack of thunder that followed was instantaneous and deafening, shaking the ground beneath me. My ears rang, and my heart felt like it stopped. For a moment, everything froze. When I blinked the afterimage away, my eyes darted to where I thought Kyle had been. But I couldn't see him. Panic gripped me. My mind raced with possibilities. Had he been hit? Was he unconscious? Worse, I wanted to call out, to scream his name, but I knew better. Shouting wouldn't help. The rain was too loud, and moving from my position could put me in danger too. I strained to listen, to hear anything over the storm. My pulse thundered in my ears, matching the rhythm of the rain. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. I kept my eyes fixed on the spot where Kyle should have been, willing him to appear, to move, to do anything. Another flash lit up the clearing, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a movement, a shadow shifting behind the tree. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Was it Kyle, or was my mind playing tricks on me? I couldn't tell. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, the rain began to ease. The deafening roar softened to a steady patter, and the wind died down. The sky, though still dark, seemed less menacing. I stood slowly, my legs stiff and shaky, and looked around. My friends were doing the same, cautiously rising from their positions. "Kyle," Mr. Davis called, his voice cutting through the diminishing storm. No response. My stomach twisted. He couldn't be. No, I wouldn't let myself think it. I scrambled toward the tree, my boots slipping in the mud. As I rounded it, my breath caught. Kyle was there, hunched over but alive, his arms wrapped around his knees, his face pale and wet with rain. He looked up at me, wide-eyed, and I realized he'd been just as scared as I was. "I'm okay," he said hoarsely, barely audible over the rain. Relief hit me like a wave, leaving me dizzy. I reached out, helping him to his feet. Together, we walked back to the group, where the others greeted him with shaky smiles and pats on the back. The rest of the hike that day was subdued. We walked in near silence, the adrenaline from the storm leaving us drained. That night, as we set up camp and tried to dry out our gear, we talked about the experience in hushed tones. None of us could forget the fear of those moments in the clearing, the helplessness we'd felt. For the rest of the trip, every rumble of thunder sent a jolt of anxiety through me. But it also taught me something: the importance of preparation, of staying calm under pressure, and of trusting the people around me. That storm at Philmont was one of the scariest moments of my life, but it also became one of the most unforgettable. Shenandoah National Park was supposed to be the perfect start to our honeymoon. It was September 2019, and my wife and I had planned a week of hiking, exploring, and enjoying the peace and beauty of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. That first evening, after arriving in town, we decided to squeeze in a short hike before sunset. The excitement of being newly married and starting our trip added to the sense of adventure. We drove along Skyline Drive, a winding road cutting through the heart of the park, with the mist hanging thick in the air. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that turns everything dull and shadowy. It wasn't raining, but the dampness clung to everything, making the air feel heavy. The scenery was beautiful in its own eerie way, the mist blurring the edges of the trees and rolling hills into something out of a dream, or maybe a nightmare. As we neared the trailhead, I spotted someone walking along the side of the road. The figure was alone, moving slowly. Something about him immediately seemed off. He was disheveled, his clothes worn and dirty, his hair unkempt. He had a vacant, almost glassy look on his face, the kind of expression that made it hard to tell what he was thinking, or if he was thinking at all. I made an offhand comment to my wife about how strange he looked, but we didn't think too much of it. After all, people of all kinds visit national parks. Maybe he was just a local or someone out for a long hike. We reached the trailhead, parked the car, and started up the mountain. The hike was supposed to be a quick one, just 1.5 miles up to where the trail intersected the Appalachian Trail, and then back down. The trail was narrow and surrounded by dense forest. With the mist rolling through, visibility was limited to maybe 50 feet ahead. It was quiet too, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind or the sound of our boots crunching against the gravel and dirt. We made good time, reaching the end of the trail in about 40 minutes. At the top, they had stretched out in either direction, disappearing into the mist. My wife stopped to use the bathroom behind some trees while I caught my breath and took in the surroundings. The air was still, the kind of stillness that presses on your ears. Even though I couldn't see far, I could feel the vastness of the landscape around me, the mountains dropping away into valleys hidden by the fog. As we were getting ready to head back down, I noticed movement in the mist. My stomach sank as the figure from earlier came into view, walking toward us. It was the same man we'd passed on the road. He wasn't moving quickly, but there was a purpose to his stride, like he had been following us. As he got closer, I noticed something else. He was holding something in his hand. At first, I thought it might be a hiking pole or some kind of tool, but as he drew nearer, I realized it was a combination hatchet and hammer. He wasn't just carrying it casually, either. It was raised slightly, not in an overtly threatening way, but enough to make me uneasy. My instincts screamed that something wasn't right. He got within a few feet of us, and then spoke. His voice was low and slow, and his words sent a chill down my spine. "Found a set of teeth up here last time," he said, almost casually, as if he were commenting on the weather. My wife and I exchanged a quick, nervous glance. I let out an awkward laugh, the kind you give when you don't know what else to do, and nodded, trying to play it cool. "Huh, that's something," I muttered, my voice shaky. He didn't say anything else, just kept walking past us, disappearing into the fog behind us. The moment he was out of sight, my wife and I started moving down the trail. At first, we walked quickly, trying not to make it obvious that we were panicked. But every nerve in my body was on high alert. The thought of that man, his vacant stare, the hatchet in his hand, and that strange comment about finding teeth, it was too much. After about 100 feet, we couldn't take it anymore. We broke into a run. The trail was steep and rocky, and the mist made it even more treacherous. We stumbled and slid, trying to keep our balance as we moved as quickly as we could. Every few minutes, we'd stop to listen, straining to hear any sound of footsteps behind us. The mist muffled everything, making it impossible to tell if we were alone or if he was following us. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but we kept moving. I couldn't shake the image of him from my mind. What was he doing up there? Why had he been following us? And what was with that comment about teeth? It didn't make any sense. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. The combination of the mist, the silence, and the growing darkness made everything feel surreal, like we were trapped in some kind of nightmare. We finally reached the trailhead, our car coming into view through the fog. Relief flooded through me, but it was tempered by the lingering fear that he might still be out there, watching us. We jumped into the car, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, catching our breath and trying to process what had just happened. On the drive back to our cabin, we barely spoke. Neither of us wanted to voice what we were both thinking, that we might have narrowly avoided something terrible. The rest of the evening was spent in uneasy silence. Even as we tried to relax, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe. The man's face, his empty eyes, and the way he held that hatchet were burned into my memory. A few weeks later, I was scrolling through the news when I came across an article that made my blood run cold. Someone had been arrested in connection with a killing near the area where we had hiked. The details were scarce, but the timeline and location matched up. My mind immediately went to the man we'd encountered on the trail. I couldn't prove it was him, but the thought that it might have been was enough to make my stomach churn. To this day, I think about that hike. The mist, the man, his strange comment, and the fear that gripped me as we ran down the mountain. It all feels like a bad dream. But it wasn't. It was real, and it was a stark reminder of how quickly things can turn from peaceful to terrifying. The wilderness can be unpredictable, not just because of nature, but because of the people you might encounter there. It was early spring, and the trails around Powell River, British Columbia, were practically deserted. The tourist season hadn't begun, and it was a quiet Tuesday, perfect for a peaceful hike. My partner and I were both drawn to the solitude that came with off-season trekking. No crowds, no distractions, just the forest, the trails, and the sound of our boots crunching the earth. The air was crisp, with the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. The trail wound through dense woods, the sunlight breaking through the canopy in patches, lighting up the moss-covered rocks and ferns. We hadn't seen another soul all day, and I was enjoying the tranquility of it all. Hiking always felt like an escape from the chaos of daily life, a chance to disconnect and ground myself in nature. After a few hours, the unexpected happened. Rounding a bend in the trail, we came across another couple. They were standing by a clearing, looking out at the forest below. The man, older with a strong Argentinian accent, greeted us warmly, a wide smile on his face. The woman, younger and Japanese, stood quietly by his side. They seemed friendly, even charming in an odd way. It was rare to meet other hikers in this area during the off-season, and before I knew it, we were deep in conversation. The man was lively and engaging, the kind of person who could talk about anything. We discussed the environment, travel, philosophy, even capitalism. He had a way of speaking that was almost hypnotic, his voice calm and measured, his words thoughtful. I was captivated. I didn't notice at first that my partner was unusually quiet, standing a little to the side, not joining in the conversation. After about 15 minutes, we reached a point where our paths diverged. As we said our goodbyes, the man invited us to an art show he was hosting that Friday. "You'll love it," he said enthusiastically. "It's something truly unique." I agreed, thinking it could be an interesting way to round out our trip. But then he stopped and asked, "Are you interested in humans traveling to other dimensions?" The question was strange, but I'm open to all kinds of ideas, even the unconventional. "Sure," I replied, more out of curiosity than anything else. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a booklet, a thick stack of photocopied pages held together with staples. "Take this and read it," he said, handing it to me. "If you like what you read, I'll give you more at the show." I thanked him and tucked the booklet into my pack. It seemed harmless, maybe just a quirky piece of philosophy or spiritual musings. As the couple continued down the trail, my partner finally broke her silence. "You shouldn't have taken that," she said, her voice flat but firm. I laughed it off. "Why not? It's just some weird pamphlet." "I didn't like him," she replied. Her tone made it clear she wasn't joking. I shrugged and let it go. We agreed to disagree, and the rest of the hike passed uneventfully. The forest felt a little less serene, though, and I couldn't shake the memory of the man's strange smile or the intensity in his eyes. That evening, back at our Airbnb, we sat around the fire pit, unwinding after the day's hike. The booklet was still in my pack, and curiosity got the better of me. "Let's see what this is all about," I said, pulling it out. My partner looked skeptical, but didn't protest. The first few pages were bizarre, to say the least. The booklet opened with a list of rules for humanity, supposedly written by some kind of alien entity. The language was dense and cryptic, filled with jargon that didn't make much sense. It claimed that humanity's destiny was tied to interdimensional travel and that these aliens were guiding us to enlightenment. The text jumped erratically from one idea to another, blending elements of religion, science fiction, and conspiracy theories into an incoherent mess. I kept reading, my unease growing with every page. The booklet talked about how Christianity, Islam, and Judaism were all correct but incomplete, missing the vital truth about aliens and their role in our existence. It described portal gates to higher dimensions and detailed rituals that groups of people were supposed to perform to open these gates. These rituals, the booklet stated, often required the ultimate sacrifice, which was chillingly vague but unmistakable in its implication. I glanced at my partner, who was watching me with a mixture of concern and "I told you so" on her face. "This is insane," I muttered, flipping to the next section. It got worse. The booklet outlined steps for joining their movement, including opening a bank account in the leader's name and donating all personal assets. It was every cult red flag rolled into one, from financial exploitation to collective suicide pacts. The language was manipulative, designed to prey on the vulnerable, promising salvation and enlightenment in exchange for complete obedience. But the final section was what truly terrified me. It wasn't written for the recipient of the booklet. It was written for the person handing it out. It was an instruction manual for how to recruit new members. It included a list of information the recruiter was supposed to collect from potential recruits: name, age, occupation, home address, and personal interests. My stomach dropped as I realized how much information I had casually shared with the man during our conversation. I had told him where we were staying, what I did for work, even details about our honeymoon plans. I felt sick. My partner didn't say anything, but her expression said it all. She had sensed something was wrong from the start, and now it was glaringly obvious. The thought of attending the art show was out of the question. I didn't even want to keep the booklet in the house. The more I thought about it, the more I hated it, the way it manipulated people, the sinister undertones of its message, and the man who had given it to me. We burned it that night in the fire pit, watching the pages curl and blacken, the flames consuming every word. It felt like the only way to rid ourselves of its presence, to sever any connection to the man and whatever twisted ideology he represented. Even now, years later, I can't forget that encounter. I wonder what would have happened if we had gone to the art show or if I had kept the booklet. The memory of that man, his unsettling charm, and the cultish booklet he handed me still sends a chill down my spine. It was a reminder that even in the most peaceful, beautiful places, danger can lurk in the most unexpected forms. A few years ago, I decided to take a solo hiking trip through the Appalachian Mountains. I'd always loved the outdoors, the quiet, the fresh air, the feeling of being completely alone in nature. Hiking solo made me feel free and capable, like I could handle anything. That day, the trail was especially quiet. No other hikers, just the sound of birds, rustling leaves, and my boots crunching on the dirt path. The day started out sunny, and I had no reason to think it would be anything but a normal hike. I had my map, plenty of water, snacks, and a lightweight rain jacket just in case. The plan was to hike out to a specific viewpoint, take in the scenery, and then loop back to my car before sunset. It was a simple trail, and I wasn't worried about anything. Around noon, I stopped to eat lunch at a clearing. The view was incredible, rolling hills stretching into the distance, layered in shades of green and blue. As I sat there, I noticed the sky starting to darken. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. Storms can roll in fast in the mountains, but they usually pass just as quickly. By the time I finished my sandwich and packed up, the wind had picked up, and the first few drops of rain were falling. I put on my rain jacket and decided to head back. That's when the rain really started coming down. Within minutes, it was like someone had turned on a faucet. The trail turned to mud, and water started pooling in places, making it hard to keep my footing. I tried to keep going, but the storm only got worse. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the wind whipped through the trees, making them creak and sway. I knew I needed to find some kind of shelter. The idea of staying on the trail in those conditions didn't seem safe anymore. That's when I saw it, a small cabin, barely visible through the sheets of rain. It was off to the side of the trail, tucked between some trees. The roof looked intact, and it didn't seem completely abandoned, though it was weathered and overgrown. I hesitated for a moment, but another clap of thunder made up my mind. I headed straight for it. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the smell of damp wood and mildew hit me immediately. The inside was dark, lit only by the faint light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. There wasn't much to the place, a single room with a wooden table, a chair, and what looked like an old, dusty sleeping bag laid out on the floor. At first, I was relieved. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but it was dry, and that was all I needed. I set my pack down on the table and sat in the chair, listening to the rain pounding on the roof. My clothes were soaked despite the rain jacket, and I shivered as I tried to warm up. That's when I noticed the carvings. The walls of the cabin were covered in them, scratched into the wood with something sharp. There were words and symbols, some of them familiar, others completely foreign to me. At first, I thought it was just graffiti left by other hikers. People sometimes carve their names or initials into trees and shelters, right? But as I looked closer, I realized this was different. The words weren't random. They formed sentences, though some of them didn't make much sense. Phrases like "do not trust the watchers" and "the forest sees you" were scrawled over and over in jagged letters. One sentence, carved deep into the wall by the window, caught my attention. "Never stay past dark." A chill ran down my spine. I tried to shake it off. It was probably just someone trying to scare people. That's what I told myself, anyway. But as I sat there, the uneasy feeling grew. The rain wasn't letting up, and the storm showed no signs of passing. The air in the cabin felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I decided to stay put for a while, but I couldn't relax. I kept glancing at the carvings, my mind racing with questions. Who had written them? Why? The more I stared, the more the symbols and words seemed to blur together, almost like they were shifting under my gaze. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a soft creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. My heart jumped, and I turned toward the sound. It had come from the window. At first, I didn't see anything. The glass was fogged up and streaked with rain, making it hard to see outside. But then, as lightning flashed, I saw it, a face, pale and expressionless, staring in at me. I froze. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The face didn't move, didn't blink. It just stared. Another flash of lightning, and it was gone. I scrambled to grab my pack, my hands shaking. I didn't care about the rain or the mud or the storm anymore. I just knew I needed to get out of there. I threw open the door and bolted back onto the trail, not even bothering to close it behind me. The rain was blinding, and the trail was slippery, but I didn't stop running. Every now and then, I glanced back, half expecting to see that face behind me. Thankfully, I didn't. Eventually, the storm began to let up, and I reached a more familiar section of the trail. The fear started to fade, replaced by exhaustion. When I finally made it back to my car, I was soaked, covered in mud, and completely drained. I sat there for a long time, staring at the trailhead and trying to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to believe it was all in my head, that the carvings, the face, and the noise were just my imagination running wild in the storm. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with that cabin, something I wasn't supposed to see. I never reported it, never told anyone except close friends. Even now, years later, I still think about that day. I haven't been back to that part of the Appalachian Mountains, and I don't plan to. Some places, I think, are better left unexplored. A few years ago, I went on a solo hiking trip to Big Bend National Park in Texas. It was something I'd wanted to do for years. There's just something about being out in the desert, surrounded by open skies, rugged mountains, and endless silence. That feels like freedom. I had planned the trip for months, choosing trails I thought would challenge me, but still be manageable. The first few days went smoothly. The weather was clear, and the trails were quiet. Big Bend isn't the kind of place where you run into a lot of people, especially during the off-season. I liked that. I wasn't looking for crowds. I was looking for solitude. By the third day, I decided to take a shorter hike. I'd already done a few long trails, so I figured I'd take it easy with something more relaxed. The window trail caught my eye, a straightforward out-and-back route that ended at a cliffside overlook. The photos I'd seen online showed an incredible view, and I was excited to see it in person. I started late in the morning, wanting to avoid the chill of the early hours. The trail was peaceful, with birds chirping and the occasional lizard darting across the path. The rocky walls on either side of the trail felt imposing, almost protective, like they were guarding a secret. As I made my way toward the overlook, I passed a few other hikers. We exchanged quick nods and hellos, but that was about it. Everyone seemed focused on their own experience, which suited me fine. The trail grew narrower as I got closer to the end. On one side, there was a steep incline covered in scrubby bushes and jagged rocks. On the other side, the land sloped down into a dry gully, its bottom hidden by thick brush. The path itself was only wide enough for one person in some places, with just enough room to feel safe, but not enough to get comfortable. When I finally reached the overlook, it took my breath away. The cliffs dropped off sharply, revealing a sweeping view of the desert below. The sky seemed endless, a deep blue that stretched on forever. I stood there for a while, soaking it in, letting the silence wash over me. After about 20 minutes, I decided to head back. The sun was higher now, and I wanted to get back to my car before it got too hot. The trail felt different on the way back. The narrow sections seemed even tighter, and the incline on one side felt steeper. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I felt a subtle sense of unease. I rounded a bend in the trail, and that's when I saw it. About 20 yards ahead, standing right in the middle of the path, was a black bear. For a moment, I froze. My heart was racing, and my brain was struggling to process what I was seeing. Black bears aren't uncommon in Big Bend, but this was the first time I'd ever encountered one in the wild. It wasn't huge, but it wasn't small either, probably a juvenile, but still big enough to be dangerous. I stood there, trying to remember everything I'd read about bear safety. Don't run. Don't turn your back. Make yourself look big. Make noise. But before I could do anything, a second bear appeared, a cub, smaller and lighter colored, trailing behind the first. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just any bear. It was a mother bear. I knew enough to understand how dangerous this situation was. Mother bears are fiercely protective of their cubs, and any perceived threat can set them off. I was too close, and the trail was too narrow. There was nowhere for me to go. The mother bear sniffed the air, her head swiveling in my direction. She didn't charge, but she didn't move off the trail either. She was grazing, her cub wandering nearby. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I needed to do something, but what? Running was out of the question. Climbing was impossible. The incline on one side was too steep, and the gully on the other side was too dense with brush. I had no choice but to stand my ground. Slowly, I reached down and picked up 2 rocks, each about the size of a softball. They were rough and heavy, the kind of rocks that would hurt if they hit anything. I wasn't planning to throw them unless I absolutely had to, but I figured it was better to have something in my hands than nothing. I took a deep breath and started making noise. I clanged the rocks together, shouting and stomping my feet. My voice echoed off the rocky walls of the trail, a jarring contrast to the silence that had surrounded me moments ago. The mother bear stopped grazing and looked up, her dark eyes locking onto me. For a terrifying moment, she didn't move. I kept banging the rocks, my voice growing louder and more desperate. Finally, she let out a low grunt and started moving. She nudged her cub toward the brush, and together they disappeared into the dense greenery. I stood there, frozen, waiting to see if they would come back. My hands were shaking so badly that the rocks nearly slipped from my grip. When I was sure they were gone, I started moving again, walking as quickly and quietly as I could down the trail. My heart was still racing, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that the bears were watching me, hidden somewhere in the brush. About 10 minutes later, I ran into a group of hikers heading in the opposite direction. I stopped them and told them about the bears, warning them to be careful. They thanked me and decided to turn back, not wanting to risk an encounter themselves. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, I saw a park ranger talking to another group of hikers. I approached him and reported the bear sighting, explaining where I'd seen them and what had happened. He nodded and thanked me, saying that other hikers had already reported the same bears earlier in the day. As I sat in my car, catching my breath and trying to calm down, I couldn't help but replay the encounter in my mind. It was a reminder of how wild and unpredictable nature can be, even in a place as beautiful as Big Bend. I still go hiking, but I'm more cautious now. I carry bear spray, and I make sure to read up on wildlife in the area before setting out. That day on the window trail was one of the scariest experiences of my life, but it also taught me to respect the wilderness and the creatures that call it home. I'll never forget the feeling of standing on that narrow trail, face to face with a mother bear, knowing that one wrong move could mean disaster. It's a memory that stays with me, a constant reminder that nature is not something to be taken lightly. It was the summer of 2019, and my wife and I had just arrived in Shenandoah National Park for our honeymoon. The park's rolling hills and dense forests were the perfect getaway after months of wedding planning and stress. We wanted to start our trip with a hike, something short and manageable to ease into the adventure. We decided on a trail off Skyline Drive, a famous road that winds through the heart of the park. It was early evening, about 6 p.m., and the mist was heavy, blanketing the road and trees in a gray, damp haze. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, and the light was fading fast. As we drove toward the trailhead, the atmosphere felt almost eerie. The mist muffled all sounds, and the road seemed deserted. That's when we saw him, a man walking along the side of the road, heading in the same direction as us. He was odd-looking, to say the least. His clothes were unkempt and wrinkled, and he carried himself with an air of vacancy, like he wasn't entirely present. His eyes didn't meet ours as we passed him, but something about him gave me a strange feeling. "Did you see that guy?" I asked my wife. "Yeah," she replied, her voice uneasy. "He seemed off." We didn't dwell on it. People come to places like this for all sorts of reasons, and it wasn't our business to judge. We reached the trailhead a few minutes later, parked the car, and started our hike. The trail was beautiful, winding gently upward through the forest. The mist gave everything a surreal quality, softening the edges of the trees and muting the colors of the leaves. It felt like we were walking through another world. We hiked for about 1.5 miles, enjoying the quiet and the cool air. At the top of the trail, we stopped to rest where it intersected with the Appalachian Trail. My wife wandered off to find a spot to pee, and I took the chance to catch my breath and drink some water. That's when I saw him again. Out of the mist, the same man we'd seen earlier appeared on the trail. He was walking toward me, his pace slow and deliberate. My stomach tightened as I recognized his unkempt appearance and vacant expression. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just another hiker who happened to take the same trail. But then I noticed something in his hand, a multi-tool with a hatchet on one end. He wasn't just carrying it. He was holding it in a way that seemed deliberate, almost like a weapon. He walked closer, and I could feel my pulse quicken. My wife was still off in the trees, and I suddenly felt very vulnerable standing there alone. As he passed me, he muttered something. His voice was low, almost a growl, but I caught the words. Last time I was up here, I found a set of teeth. I didn't know how to respond. My brain was scrambling to make sense of what he'd just said. Teeth. What did that mean? Was he joking? I forced out a nervous laugh and nodded, not wanting to provoke him. The man continued down the trail, disappearing into the mist as quickly as he'd appeared. My wife returned a moment later, and I quickly told her what had happened. Her face went pale. "We need to leave," she said. I didn't argue. We started back down the trail, moving as quickly as we could without breaking into a run. The mist felt heavier now, wrapping around us like a damp shroud. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of our boots on the gravel, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. We kept glancing back over our shoulders, expecting to see him following us. The trail was quiet, but the silence felt oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. After about 100 yards, we couldn't take it anymore. We broke into a jog, our packs bouncing against our backs. The path was uneven, and I stumbled more than once, but we didn't stop. The fear in my wife's eyes pushed me forward, and the adrenaline in my veins drowned out everything else. We paused briefly at a bend in the trail, pressing ourselves against the trees to catch our breath. The mist was so thick that we couldn't see more than a few feet ahead or behind. We listened, straining to hear any sign of movement. Nothing. "Do you think he's gone?" my wife whispered. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely audible. We started moving again, slower this time, trying to stay quiet. The air was heavy with moisture, and my clothes were sticking to my skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Finally, we reached the trailhead. Our car was parked where we'd left it, the sight of it filling me with a wave of relief. We climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, catching our breath. As I started the engine, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing at the edge of the parking lot. But there was nothing there, just the mist and the empty trail. We drove back to our cabin in silence, both of us too shaken to talk. That night, we couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made us jump. A few weeks later, I came across a news article about a man who had been arrested in connection with a murder near Shenandoah National Park. The details were sparse, but the timing and location were eerily close to where we'd been. I don't know if it was the same man we saw that day, and I don't want to know. But the memory of his vacant eyes and the way he held that hatchet will stay with me forever. That hike was supposed to be the start of a relaxing honeymoon, a chance to connect with nature and each other. Instead, it became a chilling reminder of how quickly things can turn from peaceful to terrifying. Now, whenever we go hiking, I carry a whistle, a flashlight, and a knife. My wife and I stick close to well-traveled trails, and we always let someone know where we're going. Nature can be beautiful, but it can also be unpredictable, and so can the people you meet out there. It was late spring when my partner and I decided to take a short vacation in Powell River, British Columbia. The idea was simple: unplug from the chaos of life and lose ourselves in nature. Powell River, nestled between dense forests and glimmering waters, was the perfect spot for it. We stayed at a quiet Airbnb surrounded by tall trees, and every morning, the air smelled of pine and fresh earth. It was tranquil and still, the kind of place that makes you forget the world exists. Neither of us was an experienced hiker, but we loved the idea of exploring trails without the buzz of other tourists. The season hadn't fully started, and it was a Tuesday, so we figured the trails would be empty. We set out late in the morning, our backpacks light but packed with the basics: water, snacks, and a small first aid kit. For hours, we hiked in peace. The forest was serene, the only sounds being the crunch of our boots on the dirt path and the occasional bird call. It felt like we were the only people for miles, a world away from city noise. But then, as the trail curved around a clearing, we saw them. A couple was walking toward us from the opposite direction. The man was older, maybe in his 60s, with tan skin and sharp features. He had an accent I later recognized as Argentinian. The woman was slightly younger, possibly in her 50s, with Japanese features and a gentle demeanor. They seemed friendly enough. The man greeted us with a wide smile, his dark eyes sparkling with energy. The woman followed closely behind him, her expression serene but unreadable. We stopped and exchanged pleasantries, and before I knew it, the man and I were deep in conversation. He had a way of speaking that was engaging, his words flowing smoothly as he talked about everything from the environment to travel and philosophy. My partner stood quietly beside me, barely saying a word. I didn't notice at the time. I was too engrossed in the conversation. The man was charismatic, the kind of person who could hold your attention with ease. After about 20 minutes, it was time to part ways. Their path diverged from ours, and we exchanged goodbyes. Just before they left, the man turned back and invited us to an art show he was hosting on Friday. He spoke about it with such enthusiasm that I immediately agreed to go. Then he paused and looked at me. "I want to give you something," he said, reaching into his backpack. He pulled out a small booklet, photocopied and stapled together. Its cover was plain, with no title or illustrations, just a dull gray piece of paper. "Are you interested in humans traveling to other dimensions?" he asked, his voice serious. I was caught off guard, but I nodded. I've always been open to strange ideas, and the concept intrigued me. "Take this and read it," he said, handing me the booklet. "If you like what you read, I'll give you more at the art show." I thanked him, and the couple walked away, disappearing down the trail. As soon as they were out of sight, my partner turned to me. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with unease. "You shouldn't have taken that," she said. "Why not?" I asked, genuinely confused. "I don't like him," she replied. Something about him felt wrong. I shrugged it off. The man seemed odd, sure, but I didn't think there was anything sinister about him. I stuffed the booklet into my bag, and we continued our hike. We didn't see another soul for the rest of the day. By the time we returned to the Airbnb, the sun was setting, and the forest was bathed in a warm golden glow. After dinner, we sat around the fire pit, the booklet forgotten in my bag. The next evening, with the art show looming closer, I remembered the booklet. I pulled it out, curious to see what the man had given me. My partner hesitated, but eventually sat beside me as I opened it. The first few pages were strange, to say the least. The booklet was written as a set of rules, over 100 of them, supposedly dictated by some kind of alien or higher dimensional being. The language was formal and filled with jargon, making it hard to follow. It started with ideas about spirituality and humanity's role in the universe, but as I read further, the content became darker and more unsettling. It claimed that humans needed to make sacrifices to open portals to higher dimensions. It encouraged group rituals, collective sacrifices, and complete submission to a mysterious leader. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read passages about the ultimate sacrifice. It described how groups of people could achieve transcendence by offering their lives to the cause. It wasn't just abstract philosophy. It was detailed, like an instruction manual for a cult. The further I read, the more horrified I became. The booklet wasn't just bizarre, it was dangerous. Then, on the final page, I found something that made my stomach sink. It wasn't addressed to me or any potential recruit. It was written for the person distributing the booklet. The page contained a list of information the distributor was supposed to collect from anyone who received the booklet. My name, my age, my occupation, where I lived. All things I had casually shared with the man during our friendly chat on the trail. I dropped the booklet like it had burned me. My partner was staring at me, her face pale and her hands trembling. "I told you," she whispered. "I told you not to take it." That night, neither of us could sleep. The idea that the man now had personal information about me was terrifying. I kept replaying our conversation in my head, wondering if I'd revealed too much. The next morning, we burned the booklet in the fire pit. Watching the flames consume the paper brought a small sense of relief, but it didn't erase the fear that had taken root in my mind. We didn't go to the art show. Instead, we spent the next few days avoiding secluded trails and sticking to well-populated areas. Every time we passed another hiker, I felt a twinge of paranoia, wondering if they were connected to the couple. When we finally left Powell River, I felt a wave of relief. But even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that encounter. Looking back, I realize how naive I was to trust a stranger so easily. The man's charm had blinded me to the warning signs, and my curiosity had put both my partner and me in a potentially dangerous situation. Now, whenever I go hiking, I'm more cautious. I don't engage with strangers beyond a polite greeting, and I never share personal information. Nature is a place of beauty and peace, but it's also unpredictable. And sometimes, the scariest things aren't the wild animals or the rugged terrain. It's the people you meet along the way. It was early fall when my friends and I decided to take a weekend trip to a remote hiking trail deep in the woods of the Pacific Northwest. We had been planning it for months, wanting to escape the noise of the city and spend a few days hiking in one of the most beautiful parts of the country. The air was crisp, the trees were starting to change color, and we were ready to disconnect from the world for a while. We arrived at the trailhead on a Friday afternoon, eager to begin our hike. The parking lot was nearly empty, with just a few cars parked around, and we were excited by the thought of having the entire trail to ourselves. We had a rough map of the trail, and though none of us were experienced hikers, we figured we could handle it. We packed our gear into our backpacks, making sure we had everything we might need: water, snacks, a small first aid kit, and a compass. The trail itself was peaceful, winding its way through thick trees and up gentle slopes. As we walked, the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional chirp of birds or rustle of small animals in the brush. It felt like we were alone in the world, surrounded by nothing but nature. We talked and joked with one another, enjoying the simplicity of the hike. After a couple of hours, we reached a small clearing where we decided to set up camp for the night. It was a beautiful spot, with a small stream nearby and the trees forming a natural shelter around us. We pitched our tents, gathered some firewood, and started a campfire. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the sky, and we spent the evening cooking dinner and talking around the fire. As the night grew darker, the forest around us became quiet. The wind picked up, causing the trees to sway gently, but the eerie stillness of the woods made me feel like we were being watched. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the quiet of the forest getting to me, but I couldn't ignore the unease that settled in my chest. We stayed up late, telling stories and laughing, but eventually, the fatigue of the day caught up with us, and we all retreated to our tents to sleep. The night was calm at first, but around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound. It was a low, steady thumping, like something heavy was being dragged through the underbrush. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the sound didn't seem quite right. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. My heart began to race, and I held my breath, trying to listen more carefully. The sound came closer, and I could hear the faint crunching of leaves beneath heavy footsteps. I glanced over at my friends' tents, and I could see that they were still asleep. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. I didn't want to wake them yet, not knowing what this noise could be, so I stayed quiet, hoping whatever it was would pass. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. It was coming from the edge of the clearing, and it felt like it was right outside our tents. I slowly unzipped my tent, trying to be as quiet as possible, and peered out into the darkness. The moon was barely visible through the trees, and the forest was a maze of shadows. I strained my eyes, trying to make out any shapes, but I saw nothing. Still, the sound of footsteps continued, faint but unmistakable. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was walking around our campsite, moving slowly, methodically, as if they were looking for something. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something was wrong. I reached for my phone to check the time. 3 a.m. The forest felt more alive than it had earlier, and the wind seemed to pick up again, causing the trees to groan and creak. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, just beyond my sight. Suddenly, there was a rustling from the woods, followed by a loud snap of a twig. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound was too loud, too close. I couldn't tell if it was an animal or a person, but it sent a surge of fear through me. I slowly unzipped my tent more and leaned out, trying to peer through the dark. That's when I saw him. A figure was standing just outside the circle of light cast by our campfire. He was tall, wearing a thick coat, and his face was partially obscured by a hood. I couldn't see much of him, but I could feel the weight of his presence. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring into the camp. My heart raced, and I quickly zipped my tent shut again, holding my breath. My mind was racing. Who was that? What was he doing here? The woods were deserted. There shouldn't have been anyone else around. We had been alone for hours, and the trailhead had been empty when we arrived. I glanced over at my friends' tents again, my thoughts frantic. Should I wake them? What should I do? I couldn't shake the feeling that this person wasn't lost or just passing by. There was something about his stillness, the way he just stood there, that made my skin crawl. The sound of footsteps started again, slower this time, as if the man was circling our campsite. I lay in my tent, listening to the muffled steps, feeling the terror well up inside me. It wasn't just the footsteps that frightened me. It was the silence in between them. It was as if he was waiting for something, waiting for us to make a move. I waited for what felt like hours, barely daring to breathe, too afraid to even look outside again. Finally, the footsteps stopped, and the eerie silence returned. I waited, listening intently for any sign of movement. Nothing. The man had disappeared. I didn't know what to do. It didn't feel safe to stay out there any longer, but I didn't want to alarm my friends either. I decided to wait until morning, hoping that by then, whatever had been out there would be gone. But as I lay there, unable to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, watching us from the darkness. The first light of dawn broke through the trees, and with it, I felt a slight sense of relief. The woods no longer felt as oppressive, but I still couldn't shake the fear. I waited until my friends started stirring, and then I told them what had happened. They were immediately concerned, but they hadn't heard anything during the night. They thought I had just imagined it, but I knew what I had seen. I knew someone, or something, had been out there. We packed up our campsite quickly, eager to leave the area, and made our way back down the trail. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We passed through the dense forest, our footsteps echoing in the silence. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every rustle in the trees seemed to hold a secret. When we finally reached the trailhead, we found the car and left without looking back. I didn't want to stay in those woods a minute longer. The figure in the woods had haunted me ever since. I don't know who he was or why he was out there, but I couldn't help but feel that something was off. That man wasn't lost. He was watching us, waiting for something. Maybe it was just my overactive imagination, but the terror I felt that night is something I'll never forget. The woods were supposed to be a place of peace, but now, every time I go hiking, I can't shake the thought that someone might be out there, watching from the shadows. I had always been someone who loved the peace of the wilderness. The rustling of leaves in the wind, the trickle of streams cutting through thick forests, and the sheer isolation of a good hiking trail all felt like an escape from the chaos of everyday life. So when I decided to take a solo trip up into the mountains for a long weekend, I was excited. I had spent months planning, researching the trail, and preparing all my gear. The plan was simple: 2 days, 1 night, and a hike through some of the most remote parts of the forest in the Appalachian Mountains. I thought it was just what I needed. The trail I had chosen was known for its beauty and serenity. A quiet, almost untouched path that led up to a secluded waterfall. It wasn't a widely known spot, so I figured I'd have it all to myself. I parked my car at the trailhead around mid-morning, feeling energized and ready for the adventure. The day was perfect: clear skies, a slight breeze, and the sun shining just enough to keep me warm. I had my backpack with all the necessities: water, a map, a compass, a first aid kit, and my camera for a few photos. It was going to be an unforgettable hike, I thought. The first part of the trail was easy. The path was well marked, and I found myself enjoying the quiet of the forest. I passed a few other hikers, but they were going in the opposite direction, heading back to the trailhead. Soon, I was completely alone, the sound of my footsteps the only noise in the stillness of the trees. The forest was beautiful, and it made me feel small in a comforting way. As I continued on, the trail began to narrow and wind through the trees more tightly. The occasional rock outcropping and scattered fallen logs added to the challenge. But it wasn't difficult. The air was crisp and refreshing, and the scent of pine and earth filled my senses. Around midday, I reached a small clearing near a stream. It was the perfect spot to rest and have a snack. I sat down on a large rock and pulled out some granola bars, enjoying the peaceful surroundings. The only sound was the gentle gurgle of the stream, and the sun was warm on my face. I closed my eyes for a moment, just taking it all in, when I suddenly heard a rustling in the brush nearby. I froze, my heart rate picking up slightly. It was a common sound in the woods, maybe a deer or a small animal. But there was something different about this sound. It was too loud for a deer, too deliberate. It wasn't a random rustle from the wind or animals moving through the leaves. It was a movement, one that was almost too coordinated. I glanced up, scanning the forest. The trees around me were dense, but I could still see through the gaps. Nothing. Just shadows and branches swaying in the breeze. I felt a chill down my spine but shook it off. Probably just a bird, I thought. Or maybe a squirrel, something small. I tried to relax and go back to eating, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I decided to pack up and keep moving, hoping the feeling would fade as I got farther into the hike. The trail continued upwards, and the forest seemed to get even denser. The sunlight struggled to break through the canopy, casting the path in a quiet, shadowy gloom. The deeper I went, the less I could hear. No birds, no squirrels, no animals at all. Just the sound of my own footsteps, and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind picked up. The further I walked, the quieter it became. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. The wind stopped altogether. The only sound now was the steady crunch of my boots on the earth and the occasional sound of my breath. The sense of unease that had started back at the stream had grown into something else, something darker, something that felt wrong. I tried to push it aside, focusing on the beauty around me. The trees were tall and ancient, their trunks thick with age. The smell of damp earth and moss filled my nostrils, but it wasn't enough to distract me from the feeling that I was being watched. I had been hiking alone in the wilderness before, and I knew it could sometimes make you feel paranoid, but this was different. This was something more. The air seemed heavier here, as if the woods themselves were watching, waiting. The trail eventually opened up into a more rugged part of the forest, with rocky slopes and narrow ridgelines. The way was steeper now, and the trail became more difficult to follow. I stopped for a moment to consult my map, checking the route to the waterfall. It was supposed to be just up ahead, but the trail was more obscure here, almost like it had been abandoned for some time. I didn't like the look of it, but I pressed on. I was determined to reach the waterfall before dark. I had heard that the sight of it at sunset was breathtaking, and I wasn't about to turn back now. The trail grew even thinner, and the trees began to close in around me. The sun was starting to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the path. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the waterfall before nightfall. But the further I went, the more isolated I felt. There was no noise at all now, no wind, no rustling, no distant animals. Just the sound of my own breathing and footsteps. Suddenly, the trail opened up in front of me. It led to a small clearing with a rocky ledge, and beyond that, I could see the glistening water of the waterfall below. It was more beautiful than I had imagined. The water cascaded down the rocks, creating a mist that shimmered in the fading light. The sight was peaceful, but I didn't feel peaceful. Something felt off. My unease from earlier had escalated, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that something, or someone, was nearby. I scanned the clearing, but there was no one in sight. The air was still. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. I stayed for a few minutes, taking in the view, but the discomfort grew unbearable. It was as though I was intruding on something, like I wasn't supposed to be here. I turned to leave, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of something in the trees across the clearing. A figure. It was standing still, partially obscured by the trees. It was difficult to make out in the fading light, but it looked like a person. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I froze. My heart began to race, and my breath caught in my chest. I tried to convince myself that it was just another hiker, but something about the way the figure stood, so still, so deliberate, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't see their face. They were wearing dark clothes, blending in with the forest. But their presence was overwhelming. I knew I should leave, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My legs felt like lead. The figure remained motionless, just standing there. I had no idea how long they had been there, or if they had seen me. Then, without warning, the figure stepped back into the trees and disappeared from sight. I didn't wait to see where they went. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get back to the trailhead as fast as I could. I didn't even take a moment to appreciate the waterfall anymore. I turned on my heel and began retracing my steps down the trail, my pace quickening. As I walked, my mind raced. Who had that been? Had they been watching me for a while? Was I imagining things? It didn't matter. I had to get out of there. The trail seemed longer on the way back, more confusing. The trees were more oppressive now, their shadows stretching out as the light dimmed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following me. But no one appeared. Still, the feeling of being watched never left. When I finally reached the parking lot, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I didn't care that I hadn't seen the sunset from the waterfall. I didn't care about the beautiful views. All I wanted was to be away from those woods. I reached my car and got inside, slamming the door behind me. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced back at the trailhead, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement in the trees. But there was no one there. I didn't go hiking alone in that part of the woods again. I still don't know who or what I saw out there, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched in those silent woods. The woods that seemed to breathe with an intelligence I couldn't understand. The woods that weren't as empty as they first appeared.